50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was no longer alone in the human story. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, the evidence reaches to a tiny human species with a small body, a small brain, and stone tools left in the ground. This was Homo floresiensis, not a child, not a legend, but a real branch of humanity that survived far later than it should have in our imagination. While our ancestors were moving through a widening world, this smaller human was still tied to one island, one fragile landscape, and one disappearing way of life. So why was this tiny human species still alive 50,000 years ago, and what did its survival reveal about being human? The strange thing is that most of us live inside one shape of being human, and after a while we begin to mistake that shape for the whole truth. We know the height of an ordinary adult. We know the size of a hand, the weight of a skull, the look of a face turning toward us across a room. Even without thinking, we carry a quiet picture of humanity in the body. A person is supposed to stand upright in a certain way, walk with a certain stride, grow from childhood into a familiar adult form, and belong to the same kind of world we do. But deep history does not protect that picture. It loosens it. It shows that the human line was never a clean road leading only toward us, but a branching landscape where different kinds of humans lived under different pressures, in different climates, with different bodies shaped by different places. 50,000 years ago, the world was not empty of other humans. Homo sapiens was spreading, yes, but the wider human family had not yet been reduced to one surviving species. In parts of Eurasia, Neanderthals had only recently held their ground. Denisovan ancestry still lived on through traces carried in later people. And far to the southeast, on the island of Flores, the evidence points towards something even harder for the modern mind to hold. A human species small enough to feel almost impossible, yet real enough to leave bones and stone tools in the earth. Homo floresiensis does not fit easily into the picture most people carry when they imagine the human past. It was not a giant hunter standing against the cold. It was not a taller, stronger version of ourselves. It was a small-bodied human in an island world, a being whose adult form seems to ask why evolution would ever make a human smaller, not larger. That question matters because the beginning of humanity was not a promise that bodies would always grow taller, brains would always grow bigger, and one species would naturally rise above all the rest. The beginning was more uncertain than that. Long before our cities, before writing, before farming, before the names of nations, human life was shaped by hunger, distance, birth, death, weather, tools, fire, and the difficult work of staying alive through another day. In that older world, there was no single correct design for being human. A body was not judged by how closely it resembled ours. It survived, or failed to survive, in the place where it found itself. On Flores, that place was an island, and islands have always done something strange to life. They can shrink large animals, enlarge small ones, trap populations, narrow choices, and turn ordinary survival into a long experiment. To think about Homo floresiensis is to let that island pressure enter the human story. It asks us to imagine a people who were not on the road to becoming us, not waiting to be completed by our form, but living their own narrow existence in a landscape of caves, forests, volcanic ground, seasonal food, and dangerous animals. The smallness of Homo floresiensis is often the first thing people remember, but smallness alone is not the real mystery. The deeper mystery is that this body belonged to a human branch that lasted. It had ancestors, it had generations, it had enough continuity to leave patterns in stone and bone. Every small body came from another body, every living group from older groups before it, until the beginning disappears into a past we can only approach through fragments. That is why the title of this story feels so unsettling. 50,000 years ago is late enough to feel close. It is late enough that our own ancestors were carrying their future across landscapes, but old enough that another human species could still stand outside the future that became ours. When we look at Homo floresiensis, we are not looking at a mistake in the human record. We are looking at a reminder that the record was once wider than our imagination, and that the word human once had more than one body. 50,000 years can sound distant beside an ordinary human life, but in the deep scale of evolution it is close enough to feel almost uncomfortable. It is not the age of the first stone tool, not the first appearance of the genus Homo, not the beginning of walking upright. By then, the human story was already very old. Bodies like ours had emerged in Africa long before. Homo sapiens had begun to move beyond familiar homelands, carrying tools, memories, and older generations into new lands. Yet the presence of Homo floresiensis on Flores reminds us that the world of that time was not arranged around our species alone. The human family had not yet become the lonely category it is now. It still contained other forms, other histories, other ways a body could belong to the human line. That is why this tiny species matters so much. It does not simply add a strange detail to prehistory. It changes the shape of the whole room. If a small-bodied human with a small brain could still leave evidence around that time, then humanity was not a single candle burning brighter until it became modern civilization. It was more like several quiet fires, some spread across continents, some held inside narrow landscapes, each one vulnerable to wind, hunger, chance, and time. When we think about the beginning of human life, it is easy to imagine a ladder. From primitive to advanced, from small brain to large brain, from rough stone to polished technology, from animal closeness to human mastery. But the older record does not obey that picture. The beginning was not a ladder. It was a branching field, and many branches did not point toward us. Some ended long before written memory. Some left only fragments in caves. Some survived in genetic traces inside living people. Homo floresiensis belongs to the most haunting kind of trace, because it is visible enough to become a person in the imagination, but incomplete enough to become a full story. We have bones. We have tools. We have the island. We have the approximate age of the evidence, but we do not have their voices, their names, or the way a child learned to step over volcanic stones. That absence gives the story its quiet pull. It forces the listener to stay with what can be known, and also with what has been lost. A tiny adult body found in the ground is not just a specimen. It is the doorway into generations that once woke, fed themselves, watched the sky, avoided danger, and made stone edges sharp enough to matter. The first humans and the earlier human relatives before them were never separate from such pressures. Their origins were written through feet, hands, teeth, hunger, pregnancy, injury, cooperation, and landscape. Flores makes those pressures feel concentrated, as if the island gathered the old rules of human survival into a smaller and stranger form. To stand here in the story is to feel the modern self become less certain. Our bodies are not the standard by which all earlier humans must be measured. Our success was not guaranteed from the beginning. Homo sapiens survived, but that does not mean every other human species was merely waiting to disappear. For a long time, each human group lived inside its own present, without knowing that one branch would later inherit the word humanity almost alone. Homo floresiensis could not know it was tiny in comparison to us. It could not know it would become a puzzle for scientists, a figure in museums, a pressure point in arguments about brains, islands, and evolution. It lived before our categories. It belonged to a world where survival was not about fitting a future definition, but about finding food, moving through terrain, recognizing danger, and passing life forward. That is why 50,000 years ago feels so powerful here. It is late enough to feel near the edge of ourselves, but strange enough to show that the edge was not yet closed. Another human shape still stood near the doorway of the modern world, small in body, large in meaning, and silent in a way that makes the past feel unfinished. To understand why Homo floresiensis unsettles the mind, it helps to slow down before the island itself and notice what the discovery does to the simple story people were given. The simple story says ancient humans became more modern, more capable, more dominant, until only one kind of human remained. It is clean, comfortable, and easy to remember, but the ground does not always keep clean stories. A cave floor can hold a smaller skull beside tools sharp enough to cut. A layer of soil can place a strange human form in a time when our own species was already moving through the wider world. In that moment, the human past stops looking like a march and begins to look like a room with several doors, most of them now closed. Homo floresiensis is one of those doors. It does not open into a fantasy of little people or lost tribes. It opens into a harder and quieter truth. Nature once allowed more than one human answer to exist. One answer carried a larger brain and spread widely. Another answer lived on an island, in a reduced body, close to animals and landscapes shaped by isolation. The body of Homo floresiensis asks us to remove pride from the beginning of the human story. Our origins were not guided by a plan to produce the tallest body or the largest mind. They were shaped by pressures repeated across thousands of generations. A mother had to carry a child, a foot had to find stable ground, a hand had to hold stone, a group had to remain close enough to share food and far enough from danger to survive the night. These are not dramatic ideas, but they are closer to the real beginning of humanity than any image of triumph. In that beginning, a human body was a negotiation with the world. On Flores, the negotiation took an unusual form, and because the island was limited, the consequences became deep. A smaller body may need less food. A smaller group may remain hidden more easily. A limited landscape may reward different balances of strength, movement, and energy. This does not mean every mystery is solved, and it does not mean we should know every detail of their daily life. It means the smallness itself should be treated seriously, not as a joke and not as a mistake. When listeners imagine a human species barely over a meter tall, the first feeling may be disbelief. Yet disbelief often comes from comparing them too quickly with ourselves. The more careful question is not why they failed to become like us, but why they became so well tied to their place that the island could hold them for so long. That question keeps the story close to evidence. It keeps us near bones, tools, sediments, and landscape, rather than letting imagination run ahead. The tiny human of Flores becomes more powerful when we do not exaggerate it. There is enough wonder in the simple fact that a separate human branch survived into a late chapter of prehistory, leaving behind a body that forces our categories to loosen. It tells us that being human was once a wider condition, not a single appearance. It also reminds us that survival is not the same as progress. A species can last by narrowing its needs, by fitting into a place, by becoming less visible to the grand story that later people prefer to tell. Homo sapiens would eventually be the only human species left, but that outcome was not written into the first tools, the first camps, or the first bodies that walked upright in Africa. The old human world was full of beginnings that did not become us. Some were large, some robust, some adapted to cold, some hidden in genetic fragments, and one, on Flores, was small enough to make the modern imagination pause. So when the story says that 50,000 years ago this tiny human species was still alive, it is not only asking us to look backward, it is asking us to notice how narrow our present has become, and how much human possibility had vanished before history learned to write anything down. Flores matters because it was not simply a place where a small human species happened to live. It was part of the force that made such a life possible. To understand Homo floresiensis, the mind has to leave the open map of continents and enter a narrower world, where sea, mountain, forest, cave, and volcanic ground pressed against every generation. An island is not only land surrounded by water. For a living population, it is a boundary. It decides how far bodies can move, how easily new groups can arrive, how much food can be found, how many children can survive, and how long a way of life can continue without being replaced from outside. On a continent, a changing climate may push animals and humans across wide regions. A valley dries, another valley opens. A herd moves, and the hunters follow. But on an island like Flores, escape is not so simple. The sea is not empty space. It is a wall that breathes, rises, falls, and separates. For ancient humans, water crossings were not casual movements across a modern map. They were rare and difficult thresholds, especially before boats. Language and planning can be seen clearly in the evidence. This is why the smallness of Homo floresiensis cannot be separated from the geography of Flores. The island gave the species a frame, and within that frame the old human struggle had to repeat itself over and over. Food had to be found in a limited landscape. Shelter had to be known, remembered, and returned to. Stone had to be selected from available sources, not from an endless world. Children had to grow inside a population that could not easily be refreshed by large numbers of outsiders. The beginning of human life was always tied to such material facts. Long before our species named places, drew borders, or imagined history, Human bodies were shaped by where they could walk, what they could eat, and what dangers waited beyond the firelight. Flores turns these basic facts into a concentrated lesson. It shows that the human story did not unfold only in wide savannas, ice age plains, or river valleys. It also unfolded in confined worlds, where the edges of the land could become the edges of possibility. On islands, evolution often behaves in ways that seem strange when judged from a continent. Large animals may become smaller over many generations because smaller bodies can require less food and survive better when resources are limited. Small animals may become larger if predators are fewer or if empty roles in the ecosystem allow them to expand. This pattern, often called the island rule, is not a magic law and does not explain every species in the same way, but it gives a careful way to think about Flores. The island had its own balance of animals, plants, climate, and danger. It was not a smaller copy of the mainland. It was a separate world with separate pressures. When we place Homo floresiensis inside that world, the tiny body no longer feels like a random oddity. It begins to feel like a possible answer to a long local problem. How does a human population remain alive when the land is limited, the food web is unusual, and the sea prevents easy return? The answer is not written in one bone or one tool. It is written slowly across the idea of generations. A body that needs less may have an advantage where abundance cannot be assumed. A group that learns the narrow routes between cave, water, stone, and food may survive without needing a wide homeland. A species that seems small to us may have been correctly sized for its own island. This is the first quiet shift that Flores asks from the listener. Instead of asking why Homo floresiensis was not more like us, we begin to ask what Flores required of a human body. That question brings the story closer to the oldest starting point of humanity. Not pride, not destiny, but adaptation. Every human ancestor lived inside a negotiation with place. Feet answered ground. Teeth answered food. Hands answered stone, wood, skin, and bone. Sleep answered danger. Birth answered the limits of a mother's body. Flores did not remove those ancient rules. It tightened them. It made them smaller, more enclosed, and harder to escape. So the island should not be treated as background scenery behind the tiny human species. It was part of the species' history, part of its body, and perhaps part of the reason its evidence reaches so late into the human past. The sea around Flores should be imagined slowly, not as blue distance on a map, but as a living barrier that shaped what could arrive and what could leave. Even when sea levels were lower during colder periods of the Ice Age, Flores was not simply joined to the great mainland of Southeast Asia. It sat within the island world between Asia and Australia, where channels of water could remain deep, dangerous, and difficult to cross. For ancient animals and ancient humans, this mattered deeply. A shoreline is not just the end of land. It is the place where movement becomes uncertain. A group that can walk across a plain may follow food for many days. A group facing open water must depend on chance, drift, skill, or some form of crossing that leaves almost nothing behind for archaeologists to find. This is why Flores feels like a locked room in the human story. The door was not impossible to pass, because life did reach it. But once a population was there, the island could hold it in ways a continent rarely could. Homo floresiensis belongs inside that tension. Its ancestors, whoever they were exactly, reached Flores before the evidence we now place around the late survival of this tiny species. That arrival itself is one of the quiet mysteries behind the story. We do not need to pretend we know every detail of how it happened. What matters here is that the beginning of this island human line was already tied to separation. From the first generations on Flores, survival was no longer happening in an open human world. It was happening inside a bordered one. The sea made the population smaller in possibility, even before the body itself became small in the evidence. In deep human origins, isolation can be as powerful as climate or hunger. A population cut off from larger groups does not receive the same flow of mates, habits, tools, and variation. Birth follows birth inside a narrower circle. Death removes knowledge that cannot easily be replaced. A bad season can press harder because there is no wide escape. A new danger can spread through the whole living world of a small population because the world is not very large. Yet, isolation can also protect. It can keep a species alive away from larger competitors, away from fast-moving changes, away from the heavy pressure of other human groups expanding across continents. This double nature of Flores is important. The island was a cage, but not only a cage, it was also a shelter, and perhaps for a very long time, that shelter was enough. When we think of 50,000 years ago, we often imagine movement. Homo sapiens crossing landscapes, entering new regions, carrying the long inheritance of African origins into Asia, Australia, and beyond. But the story of Homo floresiensis pulls against that motion. It asks us to imagine human survival without expansion. A smaller human species remained tied to a place where the horizon itself was a boundary. Its world may have been measured not by endless migration, but by remembered paths between cave entrances, water sources, stone, forest edge, and places where animals could be found. The origin of humanity was never separate from remembered paths. Before maps, before writing, before farming, to be human was partly to know where the body could go and where it should not go. Flores compressed that knowledge into island scale. The landscape would have taught each generation the same lesson. This is the ground that feeds you. This is the slope that tires you. This is the forest that hides danger. This is the cave that holds darkness and shelter. And beyond the shore lies a world you may never reach. Such a place can make a species conservative without making it simple. It can make life repetitive without making it easy. Stone tools found in association with this broader Flores story remind us that hands kept working, decisions kept being made, and material knowledge continued across time. But the tools also remind us of a limit. Stone can travel only where bodies carry it. Techniques can last only where people teach them. An island population may keep a way of doing things because the environment keeps asking similar questions. Cut, scrape, break, carry, return, sleep, wake, watch, repeat. These are humble actions, but they reach back toward the first human starting points, when intelligence was not an abstract idea but a practical relationship between hand, object, and need. The sea around Flores made that relationship local. It gave Homo floresiensis a world that was both complete and confined. To modern people, confinement often sounds like loss, because we live inside large networks, roads, screens, and movement. But in prehistory, a confined world could be a whole universe if it held enough food, enough shelter, enough stone, enough memory, and enough children to continue. That is the quiet power of Flores. It does not merely explain why a tiny human species was isolated. It helps us feel how isolation could become a way of life, repeated for so long that the island and the body began to seem inseparable. An island does not change a species in one dramatic moment. It works quietly, by repeating the same limits until the body and the population begin to answer them. A child is born into the food that is available, not the food that could exist somewhere else. A young adult learns the paths that fit the land, not the paths of a continent. A group survives within the number of mouths the island can support, the storms it can endure, the animals it can avoid, and the stones it can shape. Over many generations, this kind of world does not need to speak. It presses. It narrows. It selects. Flores, in this sense, was not a passive stage beneath the feet of Homo floresiensis. It was a long, patient force acting on life. The same island logic can be seen in other animals as well, and that is why the small human species should be placed within a wider living pattern. Flores is known for an unusual prehistoric world that included dwarf relatives of elephants, large rats, Komodo dragons, and other animals shaped by isolation. This does not mean Homo floresiensis followed a simple rule in exactly the same way as every island animal. Human evolution is never that easy. But it does mean the island had already shown its power to reshape bodies and ecological roles. A large animal on a limited island may become smaller, because smaller bodies can survive with less food. A small animal may become larger if the old pressures of predators and competitors change. The island does not care about what looks normal from outside. It only keeps what can continue. When we return this idea to the beginning of the human story, it becomes very important. Human beings did not begin as creatures floating above nature. They began as bodies inside nature, subject to the same deep rules of energy, reproduction, injury, and place. Our ancestors walked upright, used hands with growing skill, shared food, carried infants, and solved practical problems, but none of these abilities freed them from the land beneath them. Homo floresiensis makes this truth visible in a sharper way because the island seems to have written itself into the body. The small stature, the unusual anatomy, the limited world of caves and stone tools all point toward a human story that cannot be understood through progress alone. If we imagine evolution as constant improvement toward our own form, Flores becomes confusing. If we imagine evolution as adjustment to local conditions, Flores becomes quieter, clearer, and more unsettling. A tiny human species could survive not because it was on the way to becoming us, but because it belonged to a particular world that kept asking for a particular kind of answer. That answer may have included a body that used energy differently, a life lived close to familiar roots, and a population small enough to be shaped strongly by chance. In a large continental population, variation can spread widely, and contact between groups can bring new genes, new habits, and new possibilities. On Flores, the scale was different. A small population can carry its history in a more fragile way. Some traits may become common not because they are perfect, but because the group is small and isolated. Some knowledge may remain stable because the same landscape keeps demanding the same solutions. Some dangers may return again and again because there is nowhere else to place them. The old human starting point appears here in a very plain form. Survival was never guaranteed by being human. It was made each day through fit, memory, and endurance. A species could be human and still be trapped by drought, volcanic change, disease, shrinking food sources, or the slow mathematics of small populations. This is why Flores feels both protective and dangerous. It may have allowed Homo floresiensis to remain apart from larger human movements for a long time, but the same separation that protected it also limited its ways out. The island could preserve an old branch of humanity, then leave it vulnerable when conditions shifted. That is the deep tension behind the title. 50,000 years ago, this tiny human species was still alive in the evidence, not in some vague world of legend, but in a real island setting where evolution had been working patiently for ages. To follow that story, we must let go of the idea that the human past always expands outward. Sometimes it folds inward. Sometimes it becomes smaller, more local, more dependent on a cave, a forest edge, a shoreline, and a few paths remembered across generations. On Flores, the human story did not become grand by becoming large. It became powerful because it became narrow enough to show how much a place can shape a body and how long a small world can hold a human life before the traces begin to fade into the ground. The first thing the modern mind notices about Homo floresiensis is size, and that is exactly where misunderstanding can begin. A small body feels easy to dismiss. It can look unfinished in the imagination, as if it belonged to a child, a damaged person, or a lesser version of a human being. But the evidence that made Homo floresiensis so important was not simply the presence of small bones. It was the recognition that these remains represented an adult form, a real human species, with a body plan that did not fit comfortably into the old expectation of human progress. The smallness was not a costume placed over a modern person. It belonged to the anatomy. It belonged to the life history. It belonged to a population that had endured on Flores long enough for its body to become part of the island story. That changes the feeling of the discovery. We are not looking at someone who failed to grow into our shape. We are looking at another solution to being human under different pressures. The body of Homo floresiensis is often described as standing only a little over 1 meter tall, with a brain far smaller than that of modern humans, and with a mix of features that seemed unexpected when the remains were first studied. Yet size alone is not enough to understand what this species was. A body is not only a measurement, it is a record of movement, balance, birth, energy, food, and place. The earliest human ancestors were shaped by the same basic demands. They had to stand, walk, reach, carry, chew, rest, and survive injury. Before any later idea of civilization, before clothing became complex, before houses, farming, or written memory, the human body was already a practical instrument answering the world. Homo floresiensis brings us back to that older starting point because its small body refuses to let us separate humanity from biology. It reminds us that to be human was never only to think, it was also to fit inside a landscape with the least possible waste. On an island where resources may have been limited and populations were small, a smaller body could have mattered in a very direct way. It could require less food. It could change how far one needed to travel. It could make survival possible when the land did not support large numbers of large bodies. This does not mean we can reduce the whole species to one simple explanation. Evolution does not usually work like a single answer written clearly across a bone, but it does allow us to see why smallness should not be treated as weakness. In some worlds, the body that survives is not the largest one. It is the one that matches the demands of the place closely enough to pass life forward. This idea becomes even more important because modern people often confuse scale with value. We look at height, brain size, tool complexity, and range of movement, then arrange them in a quiet hierarchy. Bigger seems better. Farther seems more successful. More visible seems more human. But deep history is not arranged for our comfort. A small species can survive for a long time. A large species can disappear. A brain can be small and still belong to hands that made tools. A body can look strange to us and still have been normal within its own world. The origin of humanity was full of such negotiations. Our ancestors did not rise because every trait became larger and grander. They endured because different traits worked together under pressure. Feet that could travel, hands that could handle objects, social bonds that could carry knowledge, and bodies that could raise children through dangerous years. Homo floresiensis belongs to that same broad human problem, but in a compressed island form. Its small body asks the listener to slow down and ask what survival looked like before we turned it into a story about superiority. Perhaps it looked like careful movement through forest and stone. Perhaps it looked like a group returning to familiar shelter while the island around them changed slowly. Perhaps it looked like children growing into adults whose bodies were not waiting to become bigger, but were already complete for the world that held them. The quiet force of Homo floresiensis is that it makes human difference physical. It does not leave difference in abstract words. It places it in the size of a femur, the curve of a wrist, the space inside a skull, the trace of a hand that struck stone. The species was tiny only when seen from our side of time. From inside its own life, it was simply alive. A small body can change the way a life is lived, not only the way it is seen from outside. For Homo floresiensis, the body was not just a surprising measurement in a scientific report. It was the frame through which the island was felt every day. A shorter leg changes the rhythm of walking. A smaller body changes heat, hunger, fatigue, and the amount of food needed to keep moving. A smaller hand may still strike stone, grip a tool, carry food, touch a child, or feel the rough wall of a cave. Nothing about smallness removes the ordinary pressures of being alive. It only changes the scale at which those pressures are met. When modern people imagine ancient humans, they often picture strength first. Broad shoulders, long travel, large animals, harsh weather, and bodies built to endure. But endurance does not always look large. Sometimes endurance looks like needing less, moving carefully, and belonging closely to a narrow landscape. On Flores, where food, space, and population size were limited by island geography, the small body of Homo floresiensis may have been connected to a very old biological logic. Life continues when energy can be balanced. Every human beginning was shaped by energy. A mother's body needed enough food to carry pregnancy. A child needed enough care to survive helpless years. Adults needed enough strength to gather, cut, break, carry, defend, and return. Too little food, too much injury, too much distance, too many mouths, and a group could weaken over generations. This was true for our own ancestors, and it was true for other human branches as well. The body is where the world keeps its accounts. It records what can be afforded. In a rich and open landscape, larger bodies may be supported. In a restricted island environment, where available food may fluctuate and movement is contained, smaller bodies can become part of a survival pattern. This must be said carefully, because Homo floresiensis is still debated in its details, and no honest story should pretend that every bone has given up every answer. But the general principle is not strange. Islands can reshape the size of animals. Flores itself has evidence for dwarf forms of Stegodon, relatives of elephants, showing that large-bodied creatures in such settings could become much smaller through evolutionary time. Seen beside that island pattern, Homo floresiensis becomes less like an exception thrown into the human story and more like a human branch caught in the same old conversation between body and place. What makes the species so powerful is that it brings that conversation into our own family. It asks whether a human body must be tall to be complete. It asks whether a smaller brain and smaller skeleton automatically mean a lesser life. The answer cannot be rushed, because the evidence does not let us step inside their minds. Yet the stone tools associated with the Flores record show that hands were doing deliberate work. Stone does not shape itself into useful edges by accident. Someone had to choose material, strike it, use it, discard it, and perhaps teach the action again. That is why the body cannot be treated as a simple symbol of limitation. It was small, but it acted. It had needs, but it met at least some of them well enough for the population to continue. It belonged to a species that did not vanish the moment a larger kind of human existed elsewhere. In the deeper origin of humanity, this matters because our own species often tells the past as if survival followed a clear path of improvement. Bigger brain, better tools, wider range, greater control. But ancient life was not a straight contest judged by future people. It was a set of local problems. A body only had to work where it lived. For Homo floresiensis, the island was not a test of how closely it could resemble Homo sapiens. It was the entire condition of life. The caves, forest edges, volcanic slopes, streams, animals, stones, and shorelines formed the world that measured it. A smaller human crossing that ground did not know it was strange. It did not carry the burden of being compared to us. It woke inside a body shaped by ancestors, used that body to survive the day, and passed that shape forward when life allowed. That is the quiet correction Homo floresiensis gives to the modern imagination. Smallness is not absence. Smallness can be adaptation, constraint, inheritance, and history at once. The tiny human species of Flores was not less real because it was small. Its smallness is the reason the evidence feels so real, because it shows that humanity once answered the world in more than one size. There is a quiet danger in looking at Homo floresiensis only through comparison. The moment we place its small skeleton beside our own, the modern body becomes the measuring stick, and the older species becomes a deviation. Its height becomes a lack of height. Its brain becomes a lack of brain. Its island becomes a lack of world. But this way of seeing is backwards. Homo floresiensis did not live as a shadow of Homo sapiens. It lived as itself, inside a landscape that had no reason to care what future humans would consider normal. Its body should be approached almost like a map. Not a map of roads and borders, but a map of biological decisions made slowly across generations. Short legs, small stature, unusual proportions, and a small skull do not simply say less. They say different pressures, different inheritances, different balances of energy and risk. The earliest human relatives were also shaped in this way. Walking upright was not a symbol of destiny when it first appeared. It was a bodily answer to ground, food, movement, and survival. Hands did not become meaningful because they pointed toward future machines. They became meaningful because they could hold, tear, carry, strike, and care. The body came first, and ideas had to live inside it. Homo floresiensis brings that old truth back with unusual force. A tiny adult human species tells us that the human form was never frozen into one sacred design. It could bend under island pressure. It could shrink. It could keep older-looking features beside later behaviors. It could make the boundary between familiar and unfamiliar feel uncertain. This uncertainty is important because it protects the story from becoming too simple. Some scientists have debated exactly where Homo floresiensis belongs on the human family tree, whether it descended from an early Homo erectus-like ancestor that became smaller on Flores, or from an even earlier branch with primitive traits. The details are still studied, and a careful story should leave room for that, but the broad lesson remains strong. This was not a modern human population that merely looked unusual. The discovery was important because it pointed to a separate human species, a branch with its own history. That fact changes the emotional weight of the bones. They are not only small bones, they are evidence that humanity once had a shape we did not expect. Imagine the island paths again, but this time through the body. A small figure moving between shadowed trees would have known distance differently than a tall modern walker. A slope would rise in another rhythm. A carried object would weigh differently against the arm. A cave entrance would not feel scaled the same way it feels to us. This is not fantasy if it remains close to the body. Every species experiences the world through its own proportions. For Homo floresiensis, the island was not miniaturized. It was full-sized life. The trees were not smaller. The stone was not lighter. The animals were not imaginary. Hunger still arrived. Weather still changed the ground. Darkness still filled the cave. The body was small, but the world around it remained demanding. That is what gives the species dignity in the story. It was not interesting because it was cute, strange, or shocking. It was interesting because it survived inside real pressure. In the beginning of the human line, before names and myths, survival was always this intimate. It happened in joints, muscles, teeth, skin, and nerves. It happened when a wound closed or failed to close, when a child lived through fever, when an old path still led to water, when a sharp edge made food easier to use. Homo floresiensis carried that ancient intimacy in a form that our own species almost forgot how to imagine. Its smallness asks us to separate humanity from dominance. To be human did not always mean to spread widely, transform every landscape and become the last voice left. Sometimes it meant remaining local, limited and fragile, yet still real across deep time. When the evidence reaches toward 50,000 years ago, the small body becomes even more haunting. It places a different human form near the time when our own branch was growing more visible across the world. One human future was expanding. Another was still held in an island body. The contrast is not loud, but it is difficult to leave behind. It suggests that the end of human diversity did not happen all at once. It narrowed slowly, in places where bones, tools, caves and shorelines kept the last signs of lives that did not become ours. The brain of Homo floresiensis is where the story becomes more difficult, because modern people have learned to place so much faith in size. We live inside a world built by large human brains, and so it feels natural to look backward and imagine brain growth as the main road of human success. A larger brain seems to promise better memory, better planning, better tools, better speech, and a wider command over nature. But Homo floresiensis interrupts that comfortable pattern. Its brain was small, far smaller than that of Homo sapiens, and yet the species is found within a context that includes stone tools and long survival on an island that was never a simple place to live. This does not mean we should exaggerate what it could do. It does not mean we should turn a small-brained human species into a hidden genius or pretend that the evidence tells us more than it does. The power of the story is quieter than that. It asks us to separate intelligence from a single measurement. It asks us to remember that the first human abilities did not appear as abstract thoughts floating above the body. They appeared as practical acts, choosing a stone, striking an edge, remembering a path, noticing danger, sharing space, raising young, returning to shelter, and making the same difficult decisions again when the next day came. A brain is not only an object with a volume, it is part of a whole living system. It works with hands, eyes, balance, hunger, fear, sleep, and social life. In the deep beginning of humanity, thinking was not measured by books, cities, or machines. It was measured by whether a body could remain alive long enough to pass knowledge into another body. Homo floresiensis brings us back to that older and more physical meaning of mind. A small brain inside a small body may have carried a different balance of needs. It may not have supported the same range of behavior as Homo sapiens, and there is no reason to pretend it did, but the evidence does not let us dismiss it as mindless either. Stone tools matter because they sit between body and thought. A stone edge is not a dream. It is not a symbol only. It is a material decision. Someone had to recognize that one piece of stone could become more useful after being broken in the right way. Someone had to repeat that action often enough for the behavior to appear in the ground as a pattern rather than an accident. This is why the small brain of Homo floresiensis feels so important. It does not prove a modern mind. It proves that the old relationship between brain, hand, and landscape could exist in a form much smaller than our own. That is a hard lesson for modern pride. We often imagine that being human means having the largest possible inner world, but ancient survival often depended on a narrower kind of intelligence. Knowing enough, remembering enough, coordinating enough, and wasting little. On Flores, a mind did not need to design a continent-wide future. It needed to solve the island. It needed to remain connected to places where stone could be found, where food might appear, where danger might be avoided, where shelter could be used again. This is not a lesser problem simply because it is local. For a small population, local knowledge can be the difference between life continuing and life ending. The first human ancestors did not begin by mastering the whole earth. They began by learning fragments of it so well that those fragments became survivable. A water source, a ridge, a grove, a cave, a season, a herd movement, a tool-making stone. These were not small things to the people who depended on them. Homo floresiensis lived in that older scale of intelligence, where the world was not conquered but known in pieces. The small brain, therefore, becomes not just a biological fact, but a challenge to the way we tell human history. If the human story is only about bigger brains leading to greater success, then Flores becomes an error that must be explained away. But if the human story is about many kinds of bodies and minds answering many kinds of environments, then Homo floresiensis becomes part of the deeper pattern. It shows that the road to survival could be narrow, local, and still genuinely human. Its mind is mostly lost to us, because soft tissue does not remain like stone, and behavior leaves only fragments. Yet those fragments are enough to make one thing clear. The human family once included a brain that was small, a body that was small, and a life that still met the island on its own terms. A stone tool is a quiet object, but it carries a serious question. It has no voice, no face, and no memory that can speak directly to us, yet it records a moment when a mind and a hand met a material problem. A piece of stone was lifted, its weight was felt, its surface was judged, a strike was made, and the stone changed from ordinary matter into something with an edge. That edge could cut, scrape, open, divide, or prepare. For Homo floresiensis, tools are important because they keep the small brain from being treated as emptiness. They do not turn the species into a mirror of Homo sapiens, and they do not tell us that its inner life was like ours, but they show that behavior was organized enough to leave repeated traces in the ground. This is where the story must stay careful and strong at the same time. The evidence from Flores does not give us songs, painted walls, spoken words, or complete scenes of daily life. It gives us fragments, bones, tools, layers, animal remains, dates, and the island setting. Yet fragments can still change the human story when they appear in the right place. A small-brained human species associated with stone tool use breaks the lazy habit of judging intelligence only by brain volume. It tells us that the first layers of human thinking were practical before they were symbolic. In the deep origin of humanity, thought did not begin as philosophy, it began as contact. A hand learned what stone could do, an eye learned what shape might break well, a body learned that a sharp edge could make food easier to use. Knowledge lived in movement, repetition, and attention. It may have been passed through watching, imitation, and practice long before it could be explained in words we would recognize. Homo floresiensis belongs to that older scale of mind, where intelligence is not measured by how far a species travels across the planet, but by how well it answers the demands of the place it inhabits. On Flores, those demands were not small simply because the island was small. The landscape included volcanic ground, forested areas, caves, changing food sources, and animals that could be dangerous or useful depending on the moment. To survive there, a group needed more than instinct, it needed familiarity. It needed repeated decisions that worked often enough to keep children alive and adults moving. A tool edge is part of that familiarity. It turns the world into something slightly more manageable. It gives the hand a way to separate skin from flesh, plant from stem, useful piece from useless mass. It may help with food preparation or other tasks, though the exact range of use must remain cautious because stone alone does not preserve every action. The deeper point is not that Homo floresiensis had modern technology. The deeper point is that a small brain did not prevent a human branch from living inside a tool-using relationship with its environment. That should make the listener slow down before making a judgment. The modern brain loves to rank. It wants a ladder. Larger brain above smaller brain, complex tool above simple tool, wide migration above island life. But the early human world was not a school exam where one species received a final grade. It was a series of living tests without a judge. Did the group find food? Did the body heal? Did the child learn? Did the old root still lead to water? Did the stone break in a useful way? Did the night pass without disaster? These were the questions that mattered before history had language for success. Homo floresiensis reminds us that intelligence can be local, embodied, and modest in appearance. It can live in the memory of where to go, in the hand that repeats a strike, in the shared habit of returning to a cave, in the quiet recognition that one kind of stone is better than another. This does not make the species mysterious in a supernatural way. It makes it human in an older and more grounded way. The beginning of our own lineage was also full of minds that left no words, only altered stones and marks of survival. So when we look at the tools of Flores beside the small body and small brain, we are not seeing a contradiction that must be forced into a dramatic answer. We are seeing a different proportion of humanity, less brain volume than expected, less body size than expected, but enough practical intelligence to belong to a Long Island life. That is why Homo floresiensis is difficult to forget. It stands against the assumption that the human mind must always announce itself through greatness. Sometimes it leaves only an edge in the soil, and that edge is enough to make the past open again. The small brain of Homo floresiensis also teaches a second, deeper lesson. Intelligence is not always preserved in the forms we most want to find. A skull can suggest volume, a tool can suggest action, a cave can suggest return, but the living pattern that connected these things is mostly gone. We cannot hear how members of this species communicated, if their communication had sounds that carried meaning in ways we would recognize, or if much of their coordination happened through gesture, habit, attention, and repeated practice. We cannot know how they understood death, whether they noticed the absence of particular individuals in ways that became social memory, or how young ones learned the paths and materials of the island. The honest record is quieter than our questions, yet that quiet does not make the species empty. It makes the evidence more serious, because it forces us to build the story from what remains instead of from what we wish remained. In modern life, the mind is often treated as something private, hidden inside the head. But for early humans and other human relatives, mind was also visible in the outer world. It appeared in where a group returned, how stone was broken, how food was handled, how bodies gathered near shelter, how danger was avoided, and how young individuals learned enough to survive. The beginning of humanity was not made by thought alone. It was made by thought becoming movement. A remembered place becomes a path. A recognized stone becomes a tool. A watched action becomes a learned action. A repeated need becomes a tradition, even if that tradition leaves no story behind. Homo floresiensis lived in this older zone where the border between mind and body was not clean. A small brain was not floating separately from a small body. It worked through that body, through the hand, through balance, through sight, through hunger, through fear, through the limits of an island. That is why a simple ranking by brain size misses the most important question. The real question is not how much brain existed in the skull, but what kind of life that brain helped organize. The answer cannot be complete, but the fragments point away from nothingness. They point toward a tool-using, place-bound, long-lasting human branch that made enough practical decisions to remain part of the island world for a very long time. This should make us cautious about the word intelligence itself. In our own species, intelligence has become tangled with speech, writing, mathematics, architecture, technology, and the power to change landscapes at great scale. But those are late expressions of a much older capacity. Before they existed, intelligence was often small in appearance and enormous in consequence. It was noticing that a season had shifted. It was remembering which plants, animals, stones, or roots mattered. It was learning from another body without needing a written instruction. It was keeping infants alive in a world where every mistake could be final. Homo floresiensis may not have shared the same cognitive range as Homo sapiens, and a truthful account must leave that difference intact. But difference is not the same as absence. A smaller mind can still be a mind shaped by need, memory, perception, and repeated action. A smaller world can still require exact knowledge. A small population can still carry habits across generations. On Flores, a mistake about food, stone, or danger could have mattered as much as any grand invention elsewhere. The island did not ask for modern civilization. It asked for survival under local terms. The small brain of Homo floresiensis becomes haunting because it sits between two errors. One error is to look down on it, as if brain volume alone could erase the life behind the bones. The other error is to inflate it into something unsupported, as if every strange fossil must hide a dramatic secret. The better path is slower. It sees the brain as part of a complete organism, and the organism as part of a complete island world. In that view, Homo floresiensis does not need to become like us to matter. It matters because it shows that the human family once included minds, scaled differently from ours, living inside bodies scaled differently from ours, answering landscapes that our own ancestors did not control. 50,000 years ago, when the evidence for this tiny species reaches toward its last visible traces, one branch of humanity was not proving greatness through size. It was proving, in a quieter way, that being human had once been broad enough to include a small brain, a small body, a stone edge, and a life still holding on at the edge of the known world. Liang Bua is where the story becomes stone, soil, and darkness. Until a discovery has a place, it can float too easily in the imagination. A tiny human species sounds almost unreal when it is spoken as an idea, but a cave gives the idea weight. It gives it a roof of limestone, a floor of sediment, a mouth opening toward the island air, and layers where time settled one thin depth after another. Liang Bua, on Flores, is not important because it gives us a complete picture of Homo floresiensis. It does not. No cave can return an entire vanished life. But it gives enough to stop the story from drifting into myth. Bones were found there, stone tools were found there, animal remains were found there. The ground held evidence of repeated presence, activity, and change. This is where the tiny human species moves from something strange to something physical. The listener no longer has to imagine a vague island being. The mind can rest near a real cave in a real landscape where ancient bodies once occupied space before disappearing into the layers below our feet. Caves matter in human origins because they preserve what open ground often loses. Rain, roots, scavengers, erosion, and time can scatter a life until almost nothing remains. A cave can protect fragments. It can hold a jaw, a wrist bone, a piece of skull, a broken tool, a burnt patch, or the bones of animals that shared the same ancient world. It can make the invisible slightly visible again, but a cave can also mislead if we ask too much of it. A cave is not a diary. It is not a memory spoken in full sentences. It preserves accidents, habits, deaths, occupations, disturbances, and gaps. To read it honestly, archaeologists must work slowly, layer by layer, asking where an object came from, how old it is, whether it was moved, and what it can actually prove. This slow caution is part of the power of Liang Bua. The story of Homo floresiensis is not strong because it is wild. It is strong because the evidence had to survive careful questioning. The cave does not tell us what the species called itself, how it sounded, what it feared at night, or whether it had meanings we would recognize. It tells us something quieter and firmer. A small-bodied human lived on Flores, and the traces of that life were caught in the ground. That is enough to change the human story. In the beginning of humanity, before written records and before settled villages, life often left only this kind of indirect signature. A hand-shaped stone, but the hand disappeared. A body slept in shelter, but the warmth disappeared. Food was cut or broken, but the hunger disappeared. A child learned from an older body, but the lesson disappeared. What remains is the edge, the bone, the layer, the place, Liang Bua gathers those remains into a narrow opening where the past can be approached without being possessed. This is especially important for Homo floresiensis, because the species is so easy for imagination to misuse. People want to make it into a fairy tale, a lost tribe, a monster, or a secret civilization. The cave pulls the story back down. It says no, begin here, with sediment and anatomy. Begin with the evidence that can be touched, dated, measured, debated, and revised. That grounded beginning is what keeps the tiny human species real. It also gives the story a gentler kind of suspense. The more carefully we stay with the cave, the more we feel the distance between evidence and life. A skull fragment can prove existence, but it cannot return the face as it moved through a dim entrance. A tool can show action, but it cannot restore the exact moment of learning. Animal bones can show an ecosystem, but not the full soundscape of Flores in the dark. The cave gives us presence and absence at the same time. It says this species was here, and also says most of what here meant is gone. That double feeling is central to the whole story. 50,000 years ago, when the evidence reaches toward the last visible traces of this tiny human branch, Liang Bua becomes more than an archaeological site. It becomes a pause in the human record, a place where our species' lonely present meets an older, wider world. Inside that pause, the word human becomes less simple. It is no longer only the body reading the evidence. It is also the small body inside the evidence, silent under stone, still altering the shape of our origin story. Liang Bua teaches patience because the cave does not give its meaning all at once. It gives it in layers, and layers are how deep time becomes readable. One layer may hold stone tools, another may hold animal bones, another may hold fragments of a small human body, another may show a change in sediment, a disturbance, or the quiet absence of what was once expected. To the sleeping modern mind, a cave floor may seem still, but to archaeology it is a slow stack of vanished days. Each depth belongs to a different moment. Each object has to be placed carefully inside that order, because the age of a tool, a bone, or a hearth-like trace depends not only on what it is, but on where it rests. This is why the story of Homo floresiensis changed as the evidence was studied more closely. Early interpretations once suggested the species might have survived far later than the dates now widely used. Later work revised the ages of the remains and surrounding deposits, placing the fossils much earlier and the associated stone tool evidence reaching toward about 50,000 years ago. That revision is not a weakness in the story. It is one of the reasons the story can be trusted. Science becomes stronger when it corrects its own first impression. A dramatic number may attract attention, but a careful number helps the past remain honest. In a video about a tiny human species still alive around 50,000 years ago, the exact wording matters because the ground is not a legend. It is a record with limits. The fossils themselves point to a species present on Flores tens of thousands of years before that final tool horizon, while the tool evidence carries the story toward the moment when Homo sapiens was becoming more visible across the wider region. This does not give us a scene of two human species meeting face to face. It does not let us say what the last day of Homo floresiensis looked like. It gives something quieter, a narrow span where a small human branch stood close to the late human world, then slipped beyond the visible record. That is enough. In human origins, enough is often made of fragments. A jaw fragment can change a family tree. A tooth can shift a migration. A stone edge can hold the memory of a hand that no longer exists. The first human beginnings were not preserved for us with kindness. Most bodies vanished. Most camps vanished. Most voices vanished completely. What remains must be read with humility. Liang Bua is powerful because it holds both evidence and warning. The evidence says Homo floresiensis was real. The warning says we must not turn every empty space into a story we prefer. When the cave gives stone tools, we can speak of tool use. When it gives bones, we can speak of anatomy. When it gives animal remains, we can speak of a living world shared with other creatures. But when it does not give language, belief, names, or complete behavior, we must leave silence where silence belongs. That silence does not weaken the listener's attention. It deepens it. It lets the cave feel more real. Imagine the floor not as a museum display, but as a patient accumulation of ordinary survival, a stone flake dropped after use, a bone left after feeding or scavenging, a body lost to time, ash or darkened sediment needing careful study before any claim becomes safe. The old human world was built from such small events, not from the grand summaries that later minds prefer. Homo floresiensis entered the record because some of those events happened in a place that could hold them. The cave became an accidental archive. It did not preserve everything evenly. It preserved just enough to make absence visible. That is why Liang Bua feels so central to the question of 50,000 years ago. The cave does not simply say a tiny human species once existed. It shows how close the edge of knowledge really is. One layer deeper, one date revised, one object moved by natural processes, and the story can change. Yet the central fact remains steady. On Flores, a small-bodied human species left real traces in a real cave, and those traces reach into a time when the human world was narrowing toward the one species left today. To listen to Liang Bua is to hear the past speaking without raising its voice. It tells us that humanity was once wider, that evidence is precious because it is rare, and that the truth of a vanished species may survive not as a complete tale, but as a few bones and stones waiting in darkness. The most difficult thing about Liang Bua is that it feels both close and unreachable. A cave is a place a modern person can imagine entering. The air is cooler inside. The sound changes. The light weakens. The wall becomes damp or rough under the hand. A body standing there today can sense why shelter would matter to an ancient life. Yet the moment we try to turn that feeling into certainty, the past withdraws. The cave does not allow us to stand beside Homo floresiensis as it lived. It allows us to stand near the evidence after life has already become fragment. This is why Liang Bua should be treated not as a stage for invented scenes, but as a threshold. On one side is the living island, with small human bodies moving through forest, stone, darkness, hunger, and weather. On the other side is the archaeological record, where that movement has been reduced to bones, tools, sediment, and careful dating. The power of the cave lies in the space between those two sides. It is enough to make the species real, but not enough to make it familiar. That distance is exactly what keeps the story honest. Many ancient human stories become less truthful when they try to fill every silence. A quiet footprint becomes a dramatic chase. A stone tool becomes a complex plan. A cave becomes a home in the modern sense, with emotions and routines described as if someone had written them down. Liang Bua asks for a slower imagination. It asks us to see presence without pretending to own it. There were bodies here. There was activity here. There were animals in the same world. There were tools made and left behind. But the details of feeling, language, belief, and memory remain beyond the reach of the record. This does not make the species less moving. It makes it more moving, because it places Homo floresiensis in the same fragile condition as much of early humanity. Our origins are not preserved as complete biographies. They are preserved as interruptions in disappearance. A bone interrupts the loss of a body. A tool interrupts the loss of an action. A layer interrupts the loss of time. In Liang Bua, these interruptions are strong enough to change the way we think about being human. The cave shows that a tiny human species was not a rumour. It had a body that could be studied, a place that could be excavated, and a context that could be compared with the wider story of evolution. It also shows how little separates knowledge from emptiness. If the cave had not preserved the right fragments, if erosion had removed more, if the remains had never been found, then this branch of humanity might still be missing from our understanding. The word human would feel narrower simply because the evidence had stayed hidden. That thought matters deeply. It reminds us that the present shape of human knowledge is partly accidental. We do not know the past because the past wanted to be known. We know it because certain places held certain traces long enough for living people to notice them. The beginning of humanity was far wider than the small number of fossils that survived. Countless bodies vanished without leaving a name, a bone, or a tool in a place where it could be found. Homo floresiensis escaped that silence only partly. It still lost almost everything. It lost its living communities, its gestures, its ordinary days, its way of recognizing one another, its fears, its young, its old, and its final generations. But it did not lose all evidence of existence. In the ground of Flores, enough remained to tell us that another human shape was there. Enough remained to make the modern species look less alone in retrospect. Enough remained to ask why a small island could hold a human branch so late into prehistory. As we leave Liang Bua in the mind, the cave should not feel like an answer that closes the mystery. It should feel like a dim opening in the rock, where the human past briefly becomes visible before fading again. The small body, the tools, the animal bones, and the layered floor do not solve every question. They give the questions a place to stand. And once the questions have a place, the tiny human species can no longer be pushed aside as an oddity. It becomes part of the real human record, a quiet witness from an island world where another form of humanity lived long enough to leave a mark, then slipped back into darkness. Flores was not strange only because a tiny human species lived there. The whole island world around Homo floresiensis seems to have carried a kind of quiet strangeness, the kind that does not come from fantasy, but from isolation working for a very long time. When a place is separated by sea, life can begin to take forms that feel unfamiliar to creatures from the mainland. Animals arrive, or are stranded, or descend from older arrivals, and then the island begins its slow work. Bodies shrink, bodies grow, predators change, food webs become unusual, and the living world no longer follows the proportions we expect. This matters because Homo floresiensis should not be imagined alone, standing in an empty prehistoric landscape like a museum figure. It lived among other animals whose own histories had been reshaped by Flores. The island held dwarf relatives of elephants called Stegodon, large rats, Komodo dragons, and birds that belonged to an ecosystem very different from the ordinary world a modern listener may picture. In such a place, smallness was not only a human puzzle, it was part of a broader island pattern, a sign that life on Flores had been answering local pressures in ways that could make the familiar become unfamiliar. The tiny human species becomes easier to understand when the whole setting is allowed to feel different. A small human walking through that world would not have been surrounded by a simple jungle backdrop. It would have moved through a living field of risk, food, opportunity, and competition. Stegodon, though smaller than mainland elephants, would still have been significant animals, sources of meat if hunted or scavenged, and part of the same ecological story recorded in the cave deposits. Large rats may have been important in ways that sound humble but would matter greatly to survival. Komodo dragons, powerful reptiles still known from the region today, remind us that danger did not have to come from giant cats or wolves to be serious. The island had its own dangers, its own resources, and its own scale of life. To connect this back to the beginning of humanity, we have to remember that early humans and human relatives were never separate from animals. They lived by watching them, avoiding them, following them, eating them, competing with them, and sometimes being threatened by them. Before the human story became a story of cities and written names, it was a story of bodies among other bodies. The earliest tools were not abstract symbols of progress. They were practical objects used in a world where flesh, bone, plant fibre, hide, and stone had immediate meaning. On Flores, that old relationship between humans and animals became highly local. Homo floresiensis did not need to understand an entire continent. It needed to understand this island, where animals moved, where food could be found, where danger might wait, and where the body could return before darkness closed the landscape. This makes the ecosystem more than background. It becomes one of the quiet engines of the story. If Stegodon populations changed, if climate shifted, if volcanic activity altered habitats, or if the balance of animals and plants moved in a new direction, a small human population could feel those changes strongly. A large continent can sometimes absorb disruption across space. A small island may not. The world of Homo floresiensis was therefore both rich and fragile. It may have provided enough for survival across many generations, but it did so within limits. That is the pattern that keeps returning in the Flores story. Enough, but not endless. Shelter, but not freedom. Continuity, but not safety from change. The animals around Homo floresiensis make this pattern visible. They show us that the species was living inside a complete island world, not a miniature version of our own world. To modernize, A tiny human beside dwarf elephants and giant rats may sound almost impossible, but to evolution it was simply one more outcome of separation, pressure, and time. The deeper lesson is that being human did not lift a species outside the local web of life. Homo floresiensis was human, but it was also an island animal, dependent on the same food chains, landscapes, and accidents that shaped everything around it. That is what makes this chapter of deep history so quietly powerful. It reduces human pride without reducing human meaning. It shows a branch of humanity not as master of nature, but as one life among many, small, watchful, vulnerable, and real inside a world that had its own proportions. To understand the animals of Flores, it helps to remove the modern habit of seeing nature as scenery behind the human figure. In the world of Homo floresiensis, animals were not background. They were signals, dangers, meals, competitors, and sometimes the reason a place had to be remembered carefully. A forest edge could mean food, but also concealment. A cave could mean shelter, but also the remains of other lives. A riverbed could bring animals near, but also mark a place where bodies gathered and risk concentrated. The tiny human species lived inside this living pattern, and every generation would have had to learn it through the body. This is one of the oldest human starting points. Before humans wrote stories about animals, they learned animals by watching their movement, hearing them in darkness, reading tracks, recognizing remains, and understanding which creatures could be approached, avoided, followed, or used. Homo floresiensis would have belonged to this ancient relationship, not as a ruler above it, but as one participant in it. The presence of Stegodon in the Flores record gives the island world a particular weight. These were not the enormous elephants of modern imagination, but dwarf relatives shaped by island conditions. Still, even a smaller elephant-like animal would have been large beside a small human body. Its bones in archaeological context matter because they place Homo floresiensis near a real source of food and ecological complexity. Whether meat came through hunting, scavenging, or a combination that changed by circumstance, the key point is that the tiny human species lived among animals whose bodies could feed, threaten, or structure human behavior. Stone tools become more meaningful in this context. A sharp edge is not only a piece of technology, it is a bridge between a small human hand and a much larger animal world. It may help process meat, plant material, hide, or other resources, though every specific use must remain tied to evidence. What matters for the story is the practical connection. The body meets the animal, the hand meets the stone changes what the body can do. This kind of relationship reaches back toward the deep origin of our own human line, when survival depended on turning attention into action. On Flores, that action unfolded in an island ecosystem where proportions had become strange. Large rats may sound minor when compared with extinct human relatives and elephant-like animals, yet small mammals can be important in real survival. They can be prey, competitors, signs of habitat, or part of the cave record that shows what kinds of life shared the landscape. Komodo dragons add another layer. They remind us that danger on Flores could be low to the ground, patient, reptilian, and very different from the predators usually imagined in Ice Age Europe or Africa. This difference matters because it keeps the video anchored to Flores, not to a generic prehistoric world. Homo floresiensis did not live in a cold mammoth steppe or an open savanna copied from another continent. It lived in an island setting where the rules of risk were local. The dangers had local bodies. The food had local patterns. The paths had local memory. A species small in stature would have had to read that world closely. A careless movement near a dangerous animal, a missed season of available food, a wrong choice about where to sleep, or a failure to return to a known shelter could have consequences that did not need to be dramatic to be final. This is why the ecosystem around Homo floresiensis should be told slowly. It was not a cabinet of odd creatures placed beside an odd human. It was an interdependent world. If Stegodon declined, a food source or ecological relationship could change. If vegetation shifted, the animals that depended on it could shift. If volcanic activity, climate variation, or human arrival from elsewhere altered the balance, a small island population would not have unlimited space to absorb the change. The beginning of humanity was always tied to such balances. No human branch survived through intelligence alone. It survived through its place in a food web, through the timing of birth and death, through the reliability of resources, through the ability of old knowledge to remain useful when the world changed. Homo floresiensis makes this truth unusually clear because the island made everything feel closer together. The animal world was not far away from human life. It pressed against it. It entered the cave as bones. It entered the hand as tool use. It entered the body as food, fear, energy, and injury. When we imagine this tiny human species around 50,000 years ago, we should not picture it isolated from the rest of life. We should picture a small human branch moving through a living island web where every creature around it helped define what survival could mean. The animal world of Flores also shows why the survival of Homo floresiensis cannot be explained by one simple trait. A small body alone was not enough. A stone tool alone was not enough. A cave alone was not enough. Survival came from the way all of these things met inside one island system. The tiny human species lived where food, danger, shelter, and memory were tied together tightly. If one part of the system shifted, the pressure could travel quickly through the rest. A change in vegetation could affect the animals. A change in animals could affect human food. A change in water, climate, or volcanic activity could alter the routes between safe places. In a wider land, a population might move away from trouble, follow new resources, or mix with other groups. On Flores, the sea made every disturbance more intimate. The island did not need to collapse in one sudden event to become dangerous. It only needed to change enough that old knowledge no longer worked as well as before. This is one of the quietest forms of threat in human origins. Not the monster, not the battle, not the dramatic final day, but the slow mismatch between a body, a habit, and a changing place. Homo floresiensis lived in a world where the surrounding animals had already been shaped by that same island logic. Dwarf Stegodon, large rats, powerful reptiles, birds, caves, forests, volcanic slopes, and shifting habitats formed a living arrangement that had its own balance. The small human species was part of that balance, but it did not control it. This matters because modern people often imagine humans as the species that steps outside nature and looks down on it. That image belongs very late in the story. At the beginning, humans and other human relatives lived inside nature's account book. Energy taken in, energy spent, infants born, elders lost, wounds healed, animals found, dangers avoided, paths remembered. The first human worlds were not separated into human history on one side and natural history on the other. They were the same world. A tool made from stone was a natural object changed by a hand. A cave was a geological space made meaningful by use. An animal bone was both a biological remain and a sign of human possibility. On Flores, these categories overlap so closely that separating them makes the story weaker. Homo floresiensis was a human branch, but it was also part of the island's ecology, as dependent on local conditions as any other creature. This does not reduce its humanity. It brings humanity back to its older ground. To be human once meant living with limits so immediate that the body could not forget them. Hunger did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as weakness in the limbs. Danger did not arrive as a story. It arrived as movement in grass, a sound near darkness, or the absence of animals where animals usually appeared. Memory was not stored in writing. It was stored in bodies that returned to the same places because returning had worked before. The ecosystem of Flores therefore helps explain why Homo floresiensis feels so different from us, even while remaining part of the human family. It lived in a small, enclosed world where the boundary between culture and nature was thin. A stone tool may seem like culture. The animal it helped process may seem like nature. But for a small human group on an island, the two belong to the same daily rhythm. Cut, carry, eat, avoid, remember, return. These are not grand actions, yet they reach back toward the first human acts of meaning. They show a mind working through a body inside a place. The strange animals of Flores make that place visible. They tell us that the tiny human species was not simply small because of itself. It was small inside a world where many living forms had become unusual under long isolation. That is why the island ecosystem must remain in the listener's mind as the story moves forward. Without it, Homo floresiensis becomes a curiosity, an odd skeleton with a surprising date. With it, the species becomes a life form held inside a complete world, shaped by food webs, shorelines, caves, tools, predators, prey, and generations of narrow survival. The deeper we enter that world, the clearer it becomes that 50,000 years ago was not just a number, it was a fragile edge in a living system. Somewhere near that edge, a tiny human branch still left traces, while the island that had held it for so long continued changing in ways no bone can fully explain. 50,000 years ago, the world was beginning to feel different for the human family, even though no living person could have understood it that way. Homo sapiens was spreading through more landscapes, carrying bodies much like ours into regions where older human branches had already lived for a very long time. The map was changing, but not in a single day, and not with a clear announcement. It changed through births, movements, losses, contacts, pressures, and disappearances that became visible only much later. In that wider time, Homo floresiensis stands on the edge of a great narrowing. The human world had once contained many forms. Some were robust and adapted to cold. Some are known through bones. Some are known through genetic traces. Some, like the tiny humans of Flores, are known through a small number of physical remains and tools held in an island cave. By the time the evidence for Homo floresiensis reaches toward 50,000 years ago, the story is no longer just about a small species on a small island. It is about the moment when the many-bodied human world was moving toward the lonely human present we now inhabit. That idea should be approached slowly, because it is easy to make it too dramatic. We do not have to imagine a sudden conquest, a final battle, or a scene where one species looks into the eyes of another. The evidence does not allow that kind of certainty. What we can say is quieter and more powerful. Around this broad period, Homo sapiens was expanding through parts of the world, while other human species were disappearing from the visible record. Homo floresiensis survived late enough to stand near that transformation. It belonged to a world that was still plural, while our own branch was becoming more widespread. This is why the date matters so much. It does not only tell us when something existed, it tells us what else was happening around the same deep historical horizon. To connect this back to the beginning of humanity, we have to remember that there was never a moment when early human life was guaranteed to become one species ruling the earth. The first human ancestors lived as small, vulnerable populations inside landscapes they did not control. Over time, different branches moved, separated, adapted, and vanished. Some lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. Some may have met others. Some left descendants only through traces in DNA. Some left no descendants at all, only bones and tools. Homo sapiens was one branch among these branches before it became the only one left. That is the uncomfortable truth behind the tiny humans of Flores. Their existence makes our survival feel less like destiny and more like an outcome. On the island, Homo floresiensis was not waiting to be replaced in a story written by us. It was living its own present. Its generations would have known the local world of cave, forest, stone, animal, hunger, birth, and weather, not the wider transformation that later scientists would try to reconstruct. A small group on Flores could not know that far away. Other humans were moving through coastlines, river valleys, open lands, and islands. It could not know that one human species would later carry memory, language, technology, and population growth across nearly every part of the planet. From inside its own life, the future did not exist as a grand human map. There was only the island and the next need. This contrast gives the story its quiet tension. One human branch was becoming wide, another remained narrow. One was entering many environments, another was held within a single island system. One would eventually become the voice that describes all the others. Another would become a silence interpreted through bones. Yet the difference between them should not be turned into a simple judgment. Expansion is not the only form of life. Staying in place is not the same as failure. A species can be local for a very long time, if the local world still supports it. Homo floresiensis shows that the human family once had forms of survival that did not look like ours. But when the wider world began changing, local survival may have become more fragile. A branch held tightly to an island can endure for ages, then become vulnerable if the balance shifts. That is why 50,000 years ago feels like a threshold. It is not a clear door closing in front of our eyes. It is a dim boundary in the evidence, where a tiny human species still appears near the time when the world was beginning to belong more and more to Homo sapiens. The old human diversity had not yet fully vanished, but it was becoming harder to see. The spread of Homo sapiens should not be imagined as a clean wave moving across an empty world. That image is too simple, and it makes the older human branches disappear too easily. When our species moved beyond Africa and into wider regions, it entered landscapes that already had histories. Other humans had walked, hunted, rested, adapted, and died in those places before. The world was not waiting for one species to arrive and begin the story. It was already full of older beginnings. This is why Homo floresiensis matters so much beside the expansion of Homo sapiens. The tiny humans of Flores remind us that the human family was not replaced in a single clear moment. It narrowed unevenly. In some regions, other humans vanished earlier. In others, they persisted long enough to overlap in time with our own expanding branch. The evidence does not let us say with certainty that Homo sapiens and Homo floresiensis met face to face on Flores, and the story should not pretend otherwise, but the broader timing creates a quiet pressure. Our species was moving through island Southeast Asia and towards Sahul, the ancient landmass of Australia and New Guinea, by a period close to this deep horizon. Flores lay within that island world, not outside it. So even without a witnessed meeting, the tiny human species stands near the path of a changing human planet. The old human diversity was becoming exposed to a new pattern. Larger populations, wider movement, different tool traditions, and perhaps new forms of competition and disturbance. For a small island species, even indirect change could matter. A new human group in a nearby region might alter animal populations, movement routes, fire use, or pressure on resources. A new species does not need to destroy another species directly to change its world. Sometimes a rival changes the balance simply by adding another hunger, another hand, another memory system, another way of using the land. This is one of the most important lessons from human origins. The fate of a species is rarely decided by a single cause that can be pointed to like a stone on the ground. It is usually shaped by many pressures meeting at once. Climate shifts, food webs change, populations shrink, births fail to replace deaths, old knowledge becomes less useful, new competitors appear. Disease, accident, volcanic events, or ecological disruption can add weight to a system already near its limits. Homo floresiensis lived in such a system, and that makes its late survival both remarkable and fragile. To understand this, we must return to the body and the beginning of human life. Early humans did not survive as ideas, they survived as breathing groups. A small population needs enough unrelated mates, enough children reaching adulthood, enough elders or experienced adults to carry knowledge, enough food across seasons, and enough safe places to rest. When the world is wide, some losses can be absorbed by movement or contact. When the world is an island, loss has fewer places to go. The same isolation that may have preserved Homo floresiensis for a long time could have made it vulnerable when the wider human world shifted. That is the deep tension of 50,000 years ago. Homo sapiens was not simply stronger in a heroic sense. It was becoming widespread. Widespread life has advantages that an island branch may not have. It can move through more habitats. It can connect more groups. It can carry more variation. It can lose one local population and still continue elsewhere. Homo floresiensis did not have that kind of breadth, at least not in the evidence we know. It was tied to Flores, to the cave record, to a smaller living world. That tie gave it identity, but also danger. In the modern imagination, we often think survival belongs to the best species. Deep history is less comforting. Survival may belong to the species with enough numbers, enough range, enough luck, and enough flexibility at the right time. A small human species can be well adapted for a long age, then face changes that its own adaptation cannot answer quickly enough. That possibility gives the story its quiet sadness. Homo floresiensis was not less human because it vanished from the record. It was part of a broader human world that was slowly losing its branches. Around this late horizon, our species was becoming more visible, while other human forms were becoming harder to find. The tiny humans of Flores stand at that narrowing edge, where the future was beginning to sound more and more like one voice, even though the past had once spoken in many bodies. When the world of many humans began to narrow, it did not do so with a sound anyone could hear. There was no border where diversity ended, no final sign placed in the ground, no day when the last other human species understood that it belonged to an ending. From the inside, every branch of humanity was simply trying to continue. Neanderthals were not fossils to themselves. Denisovan-related groups were not genetic traces to themselves. Homo floresiensis was not a mystery to itself. Each lived inside weather, hunger, birth, injury, distance, and the memory of where life had worked before. The narrowing became visible only afterward, from the lonely position of the one human species left to study it. That is why Homo floresiensis has such a strange emotional weight. It makes the modern present feel too clean. Today, when we say human, we usually mean one species, one surviving form, one broad category wrapped around every living person on Earth. But 50,000 years ago, that word would not have fit the world so neatly. The human family still had edges, pockets, local forms, and old branches not yet erased from the record. Flores was one of those pockets. It held a small human species in an island world while the larger story of Homo sapiens was spreading beyond any single homeland. The contrast is quiet but powerful. One branch was becoming planetary, another remained local. One branch would eventually fill the word human almost entirely. Another would survive only as a question held in stone. To understand this contrast, we must resist the desire to make Homo sapiens into a sudden destroyer or Homo floresiensis into a helpless victim. The evidence is not that simple. Extinction is often a slow convergence of pressures, and the disappearance of other human forms likely involve different causes in different places. Climate, population size, competition, interbreeding in some cases, resource change, disease, and chance may all belong to the wider human story. On Flores, the exact cause behind the disappearance of Homo floresiensis is not known with certainty. That uncertainty should remain visible because it is part of the truth. But uncertainty does not make the story weak. It makes it more human. We know enough to see the pressure of the time, and not enough to turn that pressure into a simple moral tale. The beginning of humanity was never morally tidy. It was biological, ecological, and historical all at once. Bodies survived because they were born into conditions that allowed them to continue. Bodies vanished when those conditions no longer held. A human species could be intelligent, adapted, skillful with stone, and still unable to survive a shift in the world around it. This is the old lesson that Homo floresiensis carries. Humanity is not protection from extinction. It never was. Our own species escaped that fate, but escape is not the same as inevitability. It is an outcome made from numbers, range, flexibility, cooperation, invention, timing, and luck. The tiny human species of Flores had its own outcome, and because so much is missing, we have to approach it gently. Perhaps its population became too small. Perhaps ecological changes reduced familiar food sources. Perhaps the arrival or nearby spread of Homo sapiens altered the balance directly or indirectly. Perhaps volcanic events or environmental shifts changed the island in ways that made old survival patterns fail. None of these possibilities should be forced into certainty. The important point is that a small island branch had less room for error than a widespread species. Once the balance tipped, recovery may have been difficult. A few missing births, a few lost adults, a few seasons of reduced food, a few changes in animal populations, and the line between endurance and disappearance could become thin. This brings the story back to the body at the beginning of human life. Every grand species is made only of individual bodies that must wake, eat, heal, mate, carry children, teach the young, and survive the night. There is no species apart from those fragile repetitions. Homo floresiensis lived through such repetitions long enough to become one of the most important reminders of human diversity ever found. Then, Somewhere beyond the last visible traces, the repetition stopped. Not in a scene we can watch. Not in a sentence we can write with certainty. Only in the silence after the evidence ends. And from that silence, the title becomes deeper than it first seemed. 50,000 years ago, this tiny human species was still alive in the human story, but it was also standing near a narrowing that would leave our own species alone with the word human. A small population can survive for a long time and still be living close to disappearance. This is one of the hardest truths in the story of Homo floresiensis, because long survival can make a species appear secure from a distance. If a human branch endures across many generations, we are tempted to imagine that it has solved its world. It knows the caves, it knows the forest edges, it knows the animals, the stones, the routes to water, and the dangers that return with darkness. But a small island population can carry strength and fragility at the same time. Its habits may be well fitted to the place, yet the number of living bodies may remain low. Its knowledge may be old, yet held by only a few minds at once. Its world may be familiar, yet too narrow to absorb many shocks. Homo floresiensis should be imagined inside this tension. The island may have protected it from some wider pressures, but it also limited the space in which recovery could happen. In the deep beginning of humanity, survival was never just a matter of having a body that worked. It was also a matter of having enough bodies, enough adults to gather food, enough young to replace the dead, enough unrelated mates to keep a population going, enough experienced individuals to remember where food could be found when the usual places failed, enough children surviving long enough to become the next keepers of the island's habits. A species exists through these repetitions. When the repetitions become too few, even a well-adapted form of life can begin to fade. This is why population structure matters so much for the tiny humans of Flores. We do not need to know the exact number of individuals alive at any one moment to understand the principle. A species confined to an island is not like a species spread across a continent. It cannot easily draw strength from faraway groups. It cannot replace lost members with a steady flow of outsiders. It cannot escape every bad season by moving into a wide neighbouring land. The sea that once sheltered it also kept it enclosed. A small population may survive ordinary difficulty for a very long time, then become vulnerable when several pressures arrive together. A dry period, a change in animal numbers, a volcanic disturbance, a shift in vegetation, a new competitor, a run of poor births, a sickness that moves through a small group. None of these has to be the single answer. The danger lies in accumulation. For early humans and their relatives, life was always accumulated from small margins. A little more food meant strength for a child. A little less food meant weakness. A familiar path meant safety. A blocked path meant risk. A tool-making habit continued because someone was there to learn it. If too few learners remained, even useful knowledge could thin out. This brings Homo floresiensis close to the oldest human problem. How does a small group carry life forward when the world does not promise enough? Our own ancestors also faced this problem, but a widespread species has more ways to survive local loss. If one group fails, another may continue elsewhere. If one region changes, another may remain livable. A tiny human species tied to Flores had less room for this kind of redundancy. Its history may have been deep, but its living margin may have been narrow. That makes its late evidence around 50,000 years ago feel more fragile. It was not merely still alive in a heroic sense. It may have been still alive as small populations are alive, real, enduring, skilled in their place, and yet always exposed to the mathematics of birth and death. This does not make Homo floresiensis weak. It makes it natural. Every species, including ours, is made of populations before it is made of symbols. The word human can feel large, but it has always depended on small facts. A child fed, a wound survived, a route remembered, a fire or shelter used again, a body returning before night. On Flores, those facts may have been carried by a branch of humanity whose world was small enough that every loss mattered. To understand that is to see the tiny human species not as a curiosity, but as a living population pressed between endurance and vulnerability. a small population does not disappear only when the last body dies. It can begin disappearing much earlier, when the connections that hold life together become too thin. For Homo floresiensis, this idea is important because an island species depends not only on the land, but on the number and arrangement of living groups within that land. A few families scattered across a landscape are not the same as a wide network of related communities. A small group may know its world deeply, but if too many experienced adults are lost, the knowledge of safe paths, useful stones, animal habits, and seasonal food can weaken. A child may still be born, but if fewer children reach adulthood, the future becomes narrower. A tool may still be made, but if fewer hands learn the motion, the habit becomes more fragile. In this way, extinction can begin as a thinning of repetition. The old acts continue, but fewer bodies carry them. Fewer voices, fewer gestures, fewer remembered places, fewer chances to recover after loss. This is not a dramatic image, but it may be one of the most truthful ways to think about a small human species on Flores. The beginning of humanity was always social before it became historical. A human body alone is vulnerable. A child alone cannot survive. A young adult learns from others. Food is found more reliably when knowledge is shared. Danger is watched more carefully when attention is divided among several bodies. Even the simplest stone tool tradition depends on continuity between generations. Someone must show, or at least be seen doing. Someone must practice. Someone must remember which material works better. This does not require a modern classroom or spoken explanation in our sense. It only requires a living chain. Homo floresiensis, like other human branches, would have needed some form of that chain. The chain may have been small, local, and quiet, but without it, a population becomes more than biologically weak. It becomes culturally thin. That matters because island life can create situations where a population appears stable from the outside while slowly losing resilience from within. If births decline, if injuries remove adults, if food shortages weaken mothers and children, if a dangerous season repeats, the group may continue for a while, but with less room to absorb the next shock. On a continent, neighbouring groups might reconnect after trouble. On Flores, the possibilities were more limited. The sea held the species inside its own scale. The island may have allowed a tiny human branch to remain separate from wider human currents, but separation also meant fewer rescue lines when something went wrong. This is why the story of 50,000 years ago should be heard not only as a question about survival, but as a question about continuity. How many generations carried the same island knowledge before the evidence fades? How many small groups existed beyond the cave record? How far did they move across Flores? How often did they meet one another? We do not know these details, and a careful account should not pretend to know them. But the questions themselves show why population structure is central. A species is not an idea spread evenly across a map. It is a pattern of living groups, and that pattern can be dense or thin, connected or isolated, growing or quietly failing to replace itself. Homo floresiensis makes this visible because its world was so bounded. A small population inside a bounded world may survive long enough to feel ancient, yet remain vulnerable to chance. This brings the listener back to the old human starting point. Life continues through bodies, and bodies are always counted one by one. A single adult lost to injury is not only one death. It may be lost skill, lost memory, lost care for young, lost knowledge of a route, lost possibility of birth. A child who does not survive is not only grief inside a group, it is one less future body to carry the species forward. Modern people often think of extinction as a large event, but for small populations it can be made from small absences. A place becomes quieter, a path is used less often, a tool-making spot is visited by fewer hands, a cave holds fewer returns. The species may still be alive, but the web beneath it is weakening. On Flores, this possibility gives the tiny human species a deeply human sadness. It did not need to be defeated in a single moment to be endangered. It only needed to become too few, too enclosed, and too exposed to changes that a wider population might have survived. In that sense, the late traces of Homo floresiensis are not only evidence of endurance, they are also reminders that endurance can be thin, and that a branch of humanity can stand for a long time near the edge before the edge finally gives way. For a small island species, danger does not have to arrive as a single disaster. It can arrive as a slow narrowing of choices. One year, a familiar animal becomes harder to find. Another year, a path near water changes after heavy rain or volcanic disturbance. A group returns to a known place and finds fewer signs of the resources that once made the journey worth taking. None of this needs to look dramatic from the outside. But for a small population, small changes can matter with unusual force. Homo floresiensis lived inside a world where the sea limited movement, the land limited abundance, and the number of living groups may have been low. Under those conditions, survival was not only about strength or intelligence, it was about margin. How much extra food existed after the ordinary needs of the day? How many adults could be lost before care for children weakened? How many difficult seasons could pass before birth, health, and memory began to fail together? These questions bring the story away from a simple mystery and closer to the real mechanics of life. A species does not vanish because extinction is an idea. It vanishes when bodies stop replacing bodies. It vanishes when the chain of birth, learning, feeding, and return becomes too thin to hold. The beginning of humanity was built on that chain. Every early human branch, including our own, depended on repeated acts that seemed small when placed beside the word evolution. A pregnant body had to be nourished. A newborn had to be carried. A child had to be protected through years of weakness. Young adults had to learn where to walk, what to eat, how to handle stone, and when to avoid danger. Older individuals, if they survived, could carry valuable knowledge simply by having lived through earlier seasons. In a small population, each of these roles becomes more precious. The loss of one person can change more than the number of bodies. It can change the memory of the group. It can change how children learn. It can change whether a difficult season is understood or misread. On Flores, where the tiny human species was tied to a confined landscape, this kind of loss may have carried a deeper weight than it would in a wider, more connected population. We should not pretend to know the final cause of its disappearance. The evidence does not give a single clear answer. It does not say whether climate change, volcanic activity, ecological disruption, competition, arrival of Homo sapiens nearby, shrinking food sources, or population decline mattered most. The honest answer is that several pressures may have overlapped, and some may remain invisible. But the structure of the problem is clear enough to feel. An island population has fewer exits. A small species with narrow local knowledge has fewer ways to absorb sudden change. A population that has survived for a long time can still become vulnerable if the world it knows begins to change faster than its old habits can answer. This is why the late evidence of Homo floresiensis has such a quiet tension. It does not show a species confidently ruling its island. It shows a branch of humanity still present near a time when many parts of the wider human world were shifting. It had lasted, and lasting is meaningful. But lasting does not mean protected forever. The same island that had helped preserve its separate path could become a trap when the balance turned. In the modern world, people often think of survival as a sign of superiority. Deep history is less simple. Survival may depend on timing, range, numbers, accidents, and the ability of old knowledge to remain useful. Homo floresiensis may have been well fitted to Flores for a very long span, but fitness is always local and always temporary. A body fits a world only as long as that world continues asking familiar questions. When the questions change, even an ancient answer can become fragile. This is the sadness and value of the tiny human species. It shows that humanity once existed in forms that were deeply adapted and deeply vulnerable at the same time. It reminds us that extinction may begin long before the last trace appears in stone, and that a human branch can fade not because it lacked reality, but because the living web beneath it became too thin to continue. The last trace of a species is not the same as the last breath of that species. This is one of the most important truths in the story of Homo floresiensis, and it changes the way 50,000 years ago should be heard. When archaeologists speak about the latest evidence, they are speaking about what has survived in the ground, not about a final day witnessed by anyone. A bone has an age, a stone tool has a layer, A cave deposit has a place in the sequence of time. But living populations do not vanish neatly at the edge of a dated object. They move, shrink, scatter, continue somewhere else for a while, or disappear without leaving anything that can be found. The Earth does not record every life equally. It keeps some fragments and erases most others. So when we say that the evidence for Homo floresiensis reaches toward about 50,000 years ago, we are standing at the edge of visibility, not necessarily at the exact edge of existence. That distinction matters because it protects the story from false certainty. It also makes the story more haunting, not less. A last fossil is already silent, but the silence after it may be even larger. Somewhere beyond the known layers of Liang Bua, there may have been final groups whose bodies left no recoverable bone, whose tools were not preserved, whose sleeping places were washed away, buried differently, or never discovered. We cannot claim them as fact, but we must remember that absence of evidence is not always evidence of immediate absence. In human origins, this is a constant problem. The beginning of humanity was not preserved as a complete archive. Most lives passed into soil, water, animal disturbance, plant roots, heat, erosion, and time. A whole population can become almost invisible if it does not leave remains in the right place under the right conditions. This is why the visible record should be treated with care. It gives us real knowledge, but it does not give us the whole past. For Homo floresiensis, this careful thinking is essential. The tiny human species has become famous because it seems so strange and because its late evidence stands near a turning point in the wider human world. Yet fame can make people want a clean ending. The last cave, the last group, the last night, the last encounter, the last human of its kind. The record does not give us that scene. It gives us a fading signal. The signal is strong enough to show that another human branch existed on Flores. It is strong enough to connect bones, tools, and island life. It is strong enough to force modern humans to widen the meaning of human, but it is not strong enough to turn disappearance into a simple story with a final visible moment. This is where the sleep of the story becomes deeper. Instead of seeing prehistory as a film with a clear ending, we begin to see it as a landscape where lights go out unevenly. One light fades behind a mountain, another remains in a valley. Another is hidden by distance. Another may still burn for a while after we can no longer see it. Homo floresiensis may have disappeared from the visible record before it disappeared biologically, or the two may have been close together. We do not know. What we do know is that the human family was losing forms around this broad age, and that the tiny humans of Flores stand near one of the last visible edges of that older diversity. The old human starting point returns here in a very humble way. A species is made of ordinary continuations, not of dramatic endings. It continues when children are born, fed, taught, and carried into adulthood. It continues when adults find food, recover from injury, remember paths, and pass habits forward. It ends when those repetitions stop, but the stopping may leave no grand mark. The final generation of Homo floresiensis, whenever it came, may have looked to itself like any other generation under pressure. The island would still have had trees, caves, animals, stones, rain, darkness, and shorelines. The world would not have announced that a branch of humanity was about to leave it. That is why the last trace feels so fragile. It is not a closing sentence written by the past. It is the last word we have been able to hear. The visible record of Homo floresiensis is like a shoreline at low light. It shows where the land meets the sea, but not everything beyond it. Archaeology works at that edge. It can gather what remains, date what can be dated, compare layers, and build a careful picture from fragments. Yet the deeper we listen to the story, the more important it becomes to respect what fragments cannot do. They cannot tell us whether the last groups of Homo floresiensis lived only at Liang Bua, or also elsewhere on Flores. They cannot tell us how many individuals remained when the evidence thins. They cannot tell us whether the final generations disappeared quickly or slowly, whether they saw new humans in the distance, whether they changed their routes, or whether their world simply became less able to hold them. The record gives a line of sight, not a full landscape. That line of sight is precious, but it is narrow. This is why the question of 50,000 years ago has such a quiet pull. The number feels definite, but the life behind it was not a number. It was bodies moving through an island that did not know it would become evidence. It was a species living inside ordinary days, and ordinary days rarely preserve themselves well. The first human worlds were full of such lost ordinariness. A body sleeping in a shelter leaves almost nothing unless the ground is kind. A meal shared near stone tools may leave only broken bone, and sometimes not even that. A path walked for generations may vanish when vegetation grows over it, when rain cuts the slope, when ash falls, or when later animals disturb the ground. A child carried by an adult leaves no trace of the carrying. A warning sound disappears the moment it is made. A learned movement can survive in a tool pattern, but not in the breath and attention that made learning possible. Homo floresiensis sits inside this larger human problem. The species is famous because some evidence survived, but the fame can hide how much did not survive. If we are honest, the disappearance of Homo floresiensis is not a single fact we can hold in the hand. It is a fading boundary between known presence and unknown absence. That boundary may have moved as new discoveries appeared, and it could move again if future evidence is found. This is not a weakness. It is the nature of deep history. Every statement about such a distant species must stand on what has actually remained, while leaving space for the silence around it. The beginning of humanity itself must be understood this way. Our own origins are not known because the past is complete. They are known through scattered windows, a skull in one place, a tool in another, a footprint hardened by chance, a genetic trace carried through living people. Each window opens briefly, and then the darkness around it remains. Homo floresiensis gives one of those windows, and it is a remarkable one because it shows a human form so different from ours, surviving late enough to unsettle the simple story of one rising species. But the window is not the entire island. It is not every valley, every cave, every shoreline, every group. When the evidence fades after a certain horizon, we should hear that fading carefully. It says that archaeologists have not found later secure traces. It does not let us write a final scene with confidence. The last visible tool is not necessarily the last tool ever made. The last known bone is not necessarily the last body that lived. The last known cave layer is not necessarily the last shelter used. A species can pass beyond discovery before it passes out of existence, especially if its remaining groups are small, mobile, scattered, or living in places that do not preserve well. This uncertainty can be frustrating if we want a story with a clear ending, but for a sleep-like history, it gives a softer and deeper truth. Much of human existence has always happened beyond record. Most lives are not remembered by history, even in recent centuries. In deep prehistory, almost all lives vanish completely. Homo floresiensis, because it was found at all, becomes both a presence and a symbol of absence. It tells us that another human species was real, and it also reminds us that the final shape of its life remains hidden. Around 50,000 years ago, the evidence stands near a threshold. We can see the tiny human species there, not clearly enough to know its last days, but clearly enough to understand that the human past was wider than our present. Then the record grows quiet, and the silence itself becomes part of the story. The silence after Homo floresiensis is not empty. It is full of limits. It holds everything the ground did not preserve, everything later people cannot safely say, and everything that may have happened beyond the cave layers we know. This is why the last visible traces of the tiny human species should be heard almost like the fading of a distant sound. We know the sound was there because it reached us. We know it belonged to a real branch of humanity because bones, tools, and island context make the story physical. But we do not know exactly when the final note disappeared. The record grows quiet, and the quiet itself becomes evidence of how deep time works. It does not close the story cleanly. It teaches us that the past is not a complete surface. It is broken, buried, uneven, and often unfair. Some lives are preserved because they happened in a cave. Others vanish because they happened under open sky. Some bones remain because sediment covered them in the right way. Others are destroyed by water, heat, roots, animals, or the chemistry of the ground. Homo floresiensis is known because chance, geology, and careful excavation allowed a narrow window to open. If that window had stayed closed, modern humans might still believe the recent human past was simpler than it really was. This is one of the quiet moral lessons of archaeology. What we think we know about humanity depends partly on what the Earth happened to keep. The beginning of human life was never small in experience, but it is small in evidence. Every early human branch contained births, hunger, fear, injuries, learning, old age when it occurred, and the daily labor of staying alive. Yet, most of those experiences left no durable mark. A species can live for thousands of generations and still be remembered by only a few fragments. That does not make the life smaller. It only makes our view narrower. Homo floresiensis stands at that narrow view with unusual force because it changes so much with so little. A small skeleton, stone tools, and a cave on Flores are enough to disturb the modern idea that humanity moved neatly from earlier forms to ourselves. They show that another human body existed late in the story, and that its disappearance from the record may not be the same as a witnessed ending. This distinction is not just a scientific caution, it is also a way to respect the vanished. To say less than we know would make the discovery weak. To say more than we know would turn it into fiction. The stronger path is to remain near the edge. This species was real, its evidence reaches toward a late horizon, and its final biological ending remains beyond certainty. From that edge, the listener can feel the ancient world more deeply. Imagine Flores not as a place where a mystery suddenly stops, but as a landscape continuing after the visible record thins. The trees would still grow, rain would still move through the soil, animals would still pass near caves and water, the sea would still hold the island apart. If small groups of Homo floresiensis remained beyond the last known secure traces, their lives would not have looked like a legend. They would have looked like ordinary survival under pressure. If they were already gone by then, the island still would not have announced the loss. A branch of humanity can disappear without the world changing its face. That is the unsettling softness of extinction. It can leave no monument, no sudden silence that every creature hears, no visible line where one kind of human ends and another remains. It may leave only an absence that later scientists recognize by not finding more. In the oldest human story, this is perhaps the most honest kind of ending we can approach before the final chapters. Not a dramatic closure, but a thinning. Not a solved mystery, but a boundary. Not a final body in our hands, but a last known trace followed by darkness. Homo floresiensis teaches that human history is partly made from what survives, and partly from what has vanished too completely to answer us. Around 50,000 years ago, this tiny human species still reaches us through evidence. Beyond that, it recedes, leaving the modern human species to ask why the word human became so lonely, and why the Earth allowed us to hear this small lost voice at all. Homo floresiensis makes the modern mind uncomfortable because it disturbs the story we prefer to tell about ourselves. We like to imagine evolution as a movement toward greater height, greater brain size, greater reach, greater power, and eventually toward the world we now recognize. In that story, the human line becomes almost a staircase. Each step rises above the one before it. Each body seems more complete. Each tool seems closer to technology. Each migration seems closer to ownership of the Earth. But a tiny human species on Flores does not stand comfortably on that staircase. It stands to the side of it, small, late, real, and difficult to place. Its existence tells us that evolution did not move only in the direction our pride finds easy. It could also move inward, downward in size, narrower in range, more local in its answers. This is not failure in the language of nature. It is adaptation. The discomfort comes from us, not from the bones. Homo floresiensis did not know it was challenging a human idea. It did not know that future people would measure its skull against ours and wonder how such a small brain could belong to a human branch. It did not know that its height would become a symbol of everything evolution can do against expectation. It simply lived, if life allowed, in the body its ancestors had passed down. That is what makes the species so powerful. It removes the easy connection between being human and being dominant. At the beginning of human life, dominance was never guaranteed. Our ancestors were not born above the world. They were born into heat, cold, predators, hunger, injury, difficult births, fragile infants, and landscapes that gave nothing freely. To be human was first to be an organism under pressure. The later achievements of Homo sapiens can make that origin hard to feel. Cities, writing, medicine, ships, aircraft, and digital memory all create the illusion that humanity was always moving toward expansion. Homo floresiensis brings us back before that illusion. It shows a human branch whose life was not expansive in the way ours became. Its world was bounded by island shores. Its body was small. Its evidence is limited. Yet it belonged to the human family, and that fact forces a gentler, less arrogant definition of what humanity once was. The modern discomfort becomes stronger because Homo floresiensis also breaks the link between visibility and importance. Our species became visible everywhere. We spread, multiplied, transformed landscapes, and eventually became the voice that names all the others. The tiny humans of Flores did not leave such a loud record. They did not build cities, write signs, or change the world in ways that could be seen from far away. But importance in evolution is not measured by how loudly a species announces itself to the future. A quiet branch can reveal a deep truth precisely because it does not look like the winner. Homo floresiensis shows that the human past was not a coronation. It was a field of experiments, many of them local, many of them temporary, many of them gone. The beginning of humanity was a branching condition, not a single destiny. Some branches adapted to cold, some adapted to wide movement. Some left traces in living genomes. One branch, on Flores, appears to have adapted to an island world in a body that makes our own assumptions feel too large. This is why the species feels unsettling, rather than merely interesting. It turns the question back toward us. Why do we assume that bigger means more human? Why do we hear smallness as lack? Why do we treat the surviving form as if it were the intended form? Deep history does not support that confidence. It only shows that our form survived. Survival is real, but it is not proof that every other form was meaningless. A species can vanish and still reveal something essential. Homo floresiensis reveals that humanity once had room for bodies we would not expect, minds scaled differently from ours, and lives held inside places too small to become the center of later history. Around 50,000 years ago, this tiny human species was still present in the evidence, close enough in time to make the modern world feel less inevitable. It reminds us that the word human became narrow only after many other possibilities had already faded. The discomfort caused by Homo floresiensis comes from a habit hidden deep inside modern thinking. We confuse the survivor with the purpose of the story. Because Homo sapiens is the only human species left, it is easy to look backward and imagine that all earlier paths were somehow leading toward us. The past begins to look like a preparation for our body, our brain, our language, our cities, and our control over the earth. But evolution does not work with that kind of intention. It has no final image in mind. It does not try to produce the tallest human, the largest brain, or the species that will one day study the bones of others. It works through local survival, generation after generation, in places where food, danger, climate, birth, and chance decide what can continue. Homo floresiensis is uncomfortable because it makes that truth visible in a human form. Its small body and small brain do not look like the direction we expect. They look like a refusal of the ladder. The species tells us that a human branch could become smaller and still remain part of humanity. It could live in a confined world and still be real. It could leave few traces and still change the way we understand ourselves. This is a difficult idea because modern people often carry a quiet belief that progress is natural. We see our technologies, our medicine, our long-distance communication, and our ability to reshape environments. Then we imagine that the entire past was moving toward this condition. Yet the beginning of humanity was not a promise of progress. It was a struggle of bodies inside environments. Our own ancestors did not survive because the future needed them. They survived because enough individuals, in enough places, through enough generations, managed to keep living. Other human branches did the same for long periods, but their paths did not continue to the present. That does not make them failed drafts. It makes them part of the real branching history from which our loneliness emerged. Homo floresiensis sharpens this lesson because it remains so different from us while standing so late in the record. If it had lived millions of years earlier, the modern mind might place it safely in a distant category, something primitive and remote, but 50,000 years ago feels too close for that comfort. It sits near the time when Homo sapiens was expanding across wider regions, near the time when the last major forms of human diversity were beginning to vanish from sight. A tiny human species at that horizon feels like a message from a world that almost touches ours, but not in the form we expected. It says that the recent human past was not a clean mirror, it was stranger, wider, and less centered on us. This is where Homo floresiensis becomes more than a fossil discovery. It becomes a correction to human pride. Pride wants the past to be simple. Our species was smarter, therefore we survived. Others were less capable, therefore they vanished. But deep history rarely gives such clean moral arithmetic. A species can disappear for reasons that have little to do with worth. Small population size, restricted range, ecological change, isolation, competition, bad timing, and chance can matter as much as intelligence. A human branch can be adapted to its world and still lose that world. A body can fit one environment well and become vulnerable when the balance changes. The old starting point of humanity is found here again, not in grand achievement but in dependence. Every human body has always depended on water, food, care, shelter, reproduction, and the fragile passing of knowledge. Homo sapiens depended on these things too. We simply inherited the side of the story that continued. Homo floresiensis asks us to look at the side that did not continue without turning it into a lesson of inferiority. It asks us to see the vanished as part of the definition of human, not as background to our success. That is why the species feels difficult to leave behind. It does not threaten us with danger. It threatens a comforting idea. It tells us that the word human once stretched across bodies unlike ours, minds unlike ours, and worlds much smaller than ours. And if that is true, then our present form is not the measure of all humanity, but only the last remaining shape of a much wider past. Homo floresiensis makes us uncomfortable because it removes the safety of distance. It is not only that a small human species once existed, many strange forms have existed in the long history of life. The deeper discomfort is that this species existed late enough to press against the edge of our own story. 50,000 years ago is not near in the measure of one lifetime, but it is near in the measure of human evolution. By then, Homo sapiens had bodies like ours. The world was already holding the ancestors of later people who would cross rivers, coastlines, forests, and islands, carrying the future of our species into many directions. And still, on Flores, another human form had left evidence of life. This closeness does something strange to the mind. It prevents us from placing Homo floresiensis safely in a remote beginning, where anything can be excused as primitive and far away. It belongs instead to a late human world, a world where our own branch was already becoming the branch that would remain. That is why the tiny body feels almost like a question placed beside us rather than behind us. It asks why our shape survived while another human shape faded. It asks why the present is so narrow when the past was so wide. It asks why we call ourselves human, as if the word had always belonged only to one body. The old starting point of humanity becomes visible again here, not as glory, but as uncertainty. At the beginning, there was no guarantee that one lineage would become the storyteller of all the others. There were only populations, each carrying its own fragile balance of bodies, tools, places, and births. Homo sapiens became widespread, but widespread does not mean destined. Homo floresiensis remained local, but local does not mean meaningless. The discomfort comes when we realize that these judgments are made from after the fact. We know the outcome, so we mistake the outcome for a plan. The island species did not know it was losing a future. Our ancestors did not know they were becoming the last humans. The world did not know that one form would inherit the name. Everything was still happening from the inside, one generation at a time. This is why Homo floresiensis should not be used as a simple symbol of failure. Its small body, small brain, and island life do not prove that it was less worthy of the word human. They prove that the human family once had more forms than the modern mind easily accepts. The species makes us look again at the values hidden inside our language. We say advanced, and often mean similar to us. We say primitive, and often mean unlike us. We say successful, and often mean still alive today. But deep time does not speak with those values. It shows only what continued, what changed, and what disappeared. A vanished species may have survived for an immense span before vanishing. A surviving species may owe part of its survival to luck, geography, numbers, and timing as much as to skill. Homo floresiensis stands in that uncomfortable space between wonder and humility. It shows that human life can be small without being unreal, local without being simple, extinct without being unimportant. It also reminds us that the present has hidden losses inside it. When we look around today and see only Homo sapiens, the absence of other humans feels normal because we were born into it. But normal is not the same as ancient. For much of the broader human story, our species was not alone. Other branches carried other bodies through other worlds. Some met our ancestors, some may never have met them. Some left genetic echoes, some left only bones. One left a small body on an island that still asks us to loosen the shape of our imagination. This is the reason Homo floresiensis remains difficult to forget. It does not only add another fossil to the record, it takes away the comfort of believing that humanity was always moving toward us. It leaves us with a quieter, truer picture, a branching human past, full of lives that were complete in their own time, even if they did not survive into ours. If Homo floresiensis was small, if its brain was small, if its world was narrow, and if it eventually vanished, then a quiet question begins to form beneath all the evidence. What made it human? This question cannot be answered by one measurement. It cannot be answered by height, because a tall body is not the source of humanity. It cannot be answered by brain size alone, because the human family included minds and bodies that did not all match the modern form. It cannot be answered by survival into the present, because many real branches of life vanish without becoming less real. Homo floresiensis asks us to place the word human back into deep time, before it became attached only to us. Today, the word feels simple because only Homo sapiens remains. Every living person belongs to one species, and that unity makes the category feel natural. But the past was not born unified. It became unified after losses. Before those losses, humanity was a wider biological family, with different branches carrying different bodies through different landscapes. Homo floresiensis belonged to that wider family, and its existence forces us to ask whether our definition of human has become too narrow because the other forms are gone. The beginning of humanity was not a single moment when a creature suddenly became like us in every way. It was a long, uneven process, unfolding through walking, tool use, changing diets, social life, growing childhoods, and the slow shaping of bodies by environments. Some traits appeared in one branch, some in another, some changed, some remained, and some disappeared. The human family tree was never a clean line of improvement. It was a branching system of experiments made by nature, time, and place. Homo floresiensis stands as one of the most surprising branches because it carries the word human into a body that modern expectations resist. A small adult body, a small brain, an island range, stone tools, a late presence in the record. None of these alone defines the species fully, but together they show a form of life that cannot be dismissed as animal in the ordinary sense, and cannot be absorbed into Homo sapiens either. It belonged near us, but it was not us. That closeness and difference are what make it so valuable. To define human only by ourselves is to let the surviving branch rewrite the whole tree in its own image. But if we look more carefully, humanity becomes less like a crown and more like a condition, a way of being an upright, tool-using, socially dependent, biologically vulnerable creature within a changing world. Homo floresiensis seems to have shared enough of that condition to belong inside the story, even if much of its inner life remains unknown. It had a body shaped by ancestry. It had hands that lived in relationship with stone. It had a population that continued across generations. It had young who had to grow, adults who had to find food, and some kind of lived knowledge that tied bodies to place. These are not small facts. They are the older foundation beneath all later human achievements. Before art, farming, writing, law, and science, there was the quieter basis of human life. Bodies cooperating enough to keep memory alive through another generation. That is where Homo floresiensis meets us, not in sameness, but in shared vulnerability. It reminds us that being human did not always mean having our range of language, our symbolic world, or our technological power. It may have meant something more basic and more ancient, a body that depends on others, a mind that learns from surroundings, a hand that changes material, and a life that must be carried forward by the fragile chain of birth and care. The tiny humans of Flores make this definition feel both wider and more humble. They show that humanity was not only the species that conquered distance, it was also the branch that remained on an island. It was not only the large brain that built the future, it was also the small brain that answered a local world. It was not only the body that survived into us, it was also the body that vanished after leaving just enough evidence to trouble our certainty. In that way, Homo floresiensis does not weaken the meaning of human, it deepens it. It takes the word away from pride and returns it to the long, fragile, branching history of life itself. A definition of human becomes harder when the other humans are gone. If Neanderthals still lived today, if Denisovan-related people still stood beside us, if Homo floresiensis still moved through the forests of Flores, the word human would not feel so simple. We would have to speak more carefully. We would have to notice difference without erasing kinship. We would have to accept that the human family could contain more than one face, more than one body size, more than one way of knowing a place. But because only Homo sapiens remains, the living world gives us no daily reminder of that older diversity. Our loneliness becomes invisible to us. We mistake it for normal. Homo floresiensis breaks that spell from the ground. It tells us that the present is not the full measure of the past. It tells us that the word human once reached across bodies that no longer stand in front of us. This matters because the way we define humanity shapes the way we hear extinction. If we define human too narrowly, the disappearance of Homo floresiensis becomes only the loss of a strange animal-like relative. If we define human more honestly, as a broad evolutionary family with different forms of body, mind, tool use, social dependence and adaptation, then its disappearance becomes the loss of one real human possibility, not a possibility that was destined to become us, not a hidden civilization, not a modern mind in miniature, but a genuine way that human life once existed. The beginning of humanity was not made from one trait alone. Walking upright mattered, but it was not enough by itself. Hands mattered, but hands without learning are not a full human story. Brains mattered, but brain size alone does not tell us how a life was lived. Social bonds mattered, but they leave little direct evidence. Tools mattered, but tools are only the hard remains of softer behavior. Homo floresiensis sits among all these fragments and forces them to be held together. It had an upright body, though shaped differently from ours. It had hands connected to stone tool traditions. It had generations that survived in an island world. It had a place in the family tree of human evolution, even if scientists still discuss the exact shape of that placement. Its humanity is not found in one dramatic proof. It is found in the pattern. A body, a lineage, a tool-making presence, an island ecology, a late survival, and a difference that cannot be reduced to modern human variation. That pattern is why the species matters. It widens the room. It makes the human past less like a portrait and more like a landscape with many paths. Some paths led toward us, some ran beside us for a while, some ended in places we barely know. To call Homo floresiensis human is not to make it identical to Homo sapiens. It is to admit that identity was never the requirement. A brother is not a copy, a branch is not the trunk. A vanished relative is not less real because the living family no longer resembles it closely. In deep time, kinship can look strange. It can come with different proportions, different brains, different habits, different endings. The tiny humans of Flores give that strangeness a body. They make us ask whether our idea of humanity has been shaped too much by survival and too little by relationship. The old human starting point returns again here. Before humanity became a name we gave ourselves, it was a family of vulnerable organisms trying to continue. A body had to be born. A hand had to learn. A group had to remain together long enough for knowledge to move from older to younger. A place had to be remembered. A tool had to be made again. These acts do not sound grand, but they are the foundation beneath every later human achievement. Homo floresiensis carried some version of that foundation in a smaller body, on a smaller island, under pressures that were not ours. That is why the species should not be treated as a footnote. It helps answer what human means by showing what human did not have to mean. It did not have to mean tall. It did not have to mean globally successful. It did not have to mean destined to build the modern world. It could mean a small branch of life, shaped by ancestry and island limits, still alive near 50,000 years ago, still leaving enough traces to remind us that the human story was once much wider than the one body left to tell it. To ask what made Homo floresiensis human is also to ask what we lose when only one human species remains to ask the question. The answer cannot be simple, because our own species now carries the word human alone, and loneliness changes memory. When a family has only one surviving branch, that branch can begin to feel like the whole tree. Its body becomes the standard. Its mind becomes the standard. Its way of moving, speaking, making, remembering, and surviving becomes the measure by which all earlier branches are judged. Homo floresiensis quietly resists that mistake. It does not allow the modern human body to sit at the center of every definition. It brings us back to a time when humanity was not one face, one height, one brain size, or one future. It was a set of related lives unfolding under different pressures. Some branches spread widely. Some remained local. Some carried large brains. Some carried smaller brains. Some lived in cold regions. Some lived in island forests. Some left genes inside later people. Some left only bones and stone tools. Each branch was not equally like us, but each belonged to the larger biological history that made the word human wider than the living world now shows. This matters because a definition based only on victory becomes morally and scientifically narrow. If survival into the present is the test of meaning, then every extinct species becomes a failure. But life is not so simple. The Earth is full of vanished forms that endured far longer than our own civilization has existed. Disappearance does not erase the reality of their worlds. For Homo floresiensis, this is especially important. It was not a failed Homo sapiens. It was not a human waiting to become taller, smarter, more familiar, or more modern. It was a separate human branch, shaped by ancestry and island life, living inside its own present. The beginning of humanity was made from this kind of plurality. Long before history became written, human relatives were already testing different ways of being upright, social, tool-using, and vulnerable. The word vulnerable is important. It may be one of the quietest bridges between us and them. We often define humanity through power, but ancient humanity was first defined through dependence. A child needed care, a group needed memory, a body needed food, a wound needed time, a tool needed learning, a path needed to be known before darkness. Homo floresiensis, in its small body, shared that older condition. It existed not as an idea, but as a living pattern of dependence. Its people, if we may use that word carefully for a human species whose inner life we cannot fully know, had to be born into bodies that required others. They had to grow inside a social world of some kind. They had to meet the island through learned behavior, not through instinct alone. They had to pass enough forward for the next generation to continue. That is not a small thing. It is the root beneath every human achievement, including ours. When we strip away writing, farming, nations, machines, and the modern feeling of control, what remains is a very old human foundation, bodies linked by care, memory, tools, and place. Homo floresiensis helps us see that foundation because it does not distract us with grandeur. Its world was narrow, its evidence is limited, its body was small, and still it forces the largest question. If this was human, then humanity is not a ladder of superiority. It is a family of fragile adaptations, many of them lost. That realization prepares the mind for the final movement of the story, because the value of Homo floresiensis is not only in its strangeness. Its value is in what it teaches about ourselves. We are not the definition of humanity because we were always meant to be alone. We are the remaining branch of a wider past. The tiny humans of Flores do not make that past less human. They make it more human, because they show that being human once meant more than looking like us, surviving like us, or inheriting the world as we did. The final lesson of Homo floresiensis begins quietly, because the species itself reaches us quietly. It does not arrive through a monument, a written record, a myth preserved by descendants, or a voice that can explain its own life. It arrives through fragments in the ground, a small body, stone tools, animal remains, cave layers, and the patient work of people trying to understand what those fragments mean. Yet from those small remains comes a large correction. The human story was not always the story of one species alone. It was once broader, stranger, more fragile, and more varied than the modern world suggests. Homo floresiensis teaches this not by being dramatic, but by being real. A tiny human species on an island in Indonesia, with evidence reaching toward around 50,000 years ago, is enough to change the way we think about ourselves. It shows that human diversity was not only cultural, not only about languages, tools, and customs within one species, it was biological. Different human forms once lived on the earth. They carried different bodies, different histories, and different relationships with place. Our present is not the full human condition. It is the surviving remnant of a larger family. That realization is not meant to make the listener feel small in a hopeless way. It is meant to make the listener more careful, more humble, and more awake to the depth beneath ordinary life. The beginning of humanity was never a clean rise toward mastery. It was a long, uncertain branching of bodies under pressure. Hunger shaped it, walking shaped it, birth shaped it, childhood shaped it, stone shaped it. Fire, shelter, danger, memory, and cooperation shaped it. Some branches spread, some stayed local, some interbred with our ancestors. Some vanished without leaving living descendants. Some left so little that we may never know they existed. Homo floresiensis is precious because it was not entirely lost. It reminds us that the Earth can hold a small piece of a vanished human world long enough for another human species to find it later and ask what it means. In that question there is value beyond curiosity. There is a lesson about certainty. Modern people live after the narrowing has already happened. We inherit a world where Homo sapiens is alone, and because we are alone, we easily believe aloneness was natural. But it was not always so. Our species did not begin as the only kind of human. It became the only kind left. That difference matters. It changes pride into responsibility. If the human past contained other forms of humanity, then our survival is not simply a sign that we were destined to inherit the earth. It is also a reminder that survival is rare, contingent, and easily misunderstood. Homo floresiensis may have been well fitted to Flores for a long time, yet a well-fitted life can still end when conditions shift beyond its margin. Our own species is powerful today, but power should not make us forget the old rule written into every body. Life continues only, while the conditions for life continue. This is where the tiny humans of Flores offer a quiet educational message. They teach us that difference should not be treated as failure. Smallness was not failure. Island life was not failure. Extinction was not proof that a species had no meaning. A vanished branch can still deepen the story of the tree. The small body of Homo floresiensis asks us to look at all human life with less arrogance. It asks us to notice how much of identity depends on place, food, care, chance, and time. It asks us to remember that what survives is not always the whole truth, and what disappears is not always unimportant. As the story moves toward its ending, the island of Flores remains in the mind like a dim light. A cave, a shoreline, a forest edge, stones in the hand, animals moving in the dark, and a human form smaller than expected, still present near the edge of a changing world. From that small form comes a large lesson. Humanity was once wider than us, and because it was wider, our present loneliness deserves wonder, caution, and humility. The story of Homo floresiensis also teaches that the past should be approached with tenderness, because evidence is not the same as possession. We can measure a skull, describe a femur, compare stone tools, study cave layers, and place the species in a careful scientific frame. But we cannot return the lives that once moved through Flores. We cannot give them back their mornings, their fears, their learned paths, or their final generations. The knowledge we have is real, but it is partial. That partialness should not make us careless. It should make us more respectful. A vanished human species is not only a puzzle for the mind, it is also a reminder that every living world can become unreachable. Homo floresiensis lived without knowing. It would one day become evidence. It did not exist for our questions. It existed for its own continuity, through bodies that needed food, young that needed care, hands that needed stone, and groups that needed memory. That is why the educational value of the species is not only about evolution, it is also about how we learn to think. A mature understanding of human origins does not rush to fill every silence. It accepts that some things can be known firmly, some can be inferred carefully, and some must remain open. This is not weakness, it is honesty. In the beginning of humanity, before written memory, almost everything depended on the fragile passage from one living body to another. A child learned by being near others. A path survived because someone walked it again. A tool habit continued because hands repeated it. A shelter mattered because bodies returned to it. When those chains broke, whole worlds could vanish without a record. Homo floresiensis lets us feel the value of those chains precisely because the chain is broken now. We can see only the traces after the living connection has ended. Yet those traces are enough to ask better questions. They ask us to look at ourselves not as the inevitable center of the past, but as one surviving branch that must learn from the branches that disappeared. That lesson matters beyond prehistory. It teaches humility before difference. The small body of Homo floresiensis warns us not to confuse unfamiliar form with lesser meaning. Its small brain warns us not to reduce intelligence to one measure. Its island life warns us not to treat local existence as failure. Its disappearance warns us not to believe that adaptation lasts forever. Together, these lessons return us to a simple but deep truth. Life is always fitted to conditions, and conditions always change. Our own species now lives in a world we have altered more than any earlier human branch could have imagined. We are not island-bound in the same way Homo floresiensis was, yet we are still bounded by biology, climate, food, water, care, and the health of the living systems around us. The ancient island makes a quiet mirror. A small population on Flores depended on its world more visibly than we do, but dependence has not disappeared from us. It has only become easier to overlook. We still need bodies to heal, children to be cared for, knowledge to be passed on, communities to endure, and environments that can continue supporting life. In that sense, Homo floresiensis does not sit safely behind us as a strange fossil from a finished past. It speaks into the present by showing what happens when a way of life is tightly bound to a world that can change. This does not mean our future must repeat its ending. That would be too simple and not truthful. But it does mean that vanished human branches can teach caution without fear. They show that survival is not a permanent title. It is a relationship that must keep being renewed. Homo sapiens is the only human species left, but being the last does not make us separate from the old rules. It makes our responsibility heavier. We carry the word human alone now, yet that word was shaped by many lives that did not reach the present. The tiny humans of Flores remind us that a lost branch can still educate the branch that remains, not by giving us a clear command, but by making our certainty softer, our pride quieter, and our attention deeper. The story can now return to the small body on Flores, but it returns differently than it began. At first, Homo floresiensis may have seemed strange because of size. A tiny human species, a small brain, an island cave, and evidence reaching toward around 50,000 years ago, all feel like pieces of a puzzle placed too late in the human past. But after staying with the island, the body, the tools, the animals, the cave, the population, and the silence after the last trace, the strangeness becomes quieter and deeper. Homo floresiensis was not only small, it was a reminder that humanity itself was once larger than our imagination. Larger not in body, but in possibility. There were other ways to be human, other bodies shaped by other places, other branches that lived without knowing they would one day become extinct, and without knowing that one surviving species would later try to understand them from fragments. That is the educational value of this tiny human species. It teaches that history is not only a record of what became powerful, it is also a record of what almost vanished completely. It teaches that evidence must be respected, because evidence is rare. It teaches that a small fossil can challenge a large assumption. It teaches that survival is not the same as superiority, and extinction is not the same as meaninglessness. The beginning of humanity was not clean, straight, or guaranteed. It was made from many living experiments, each tied to food, weather, children, injury, memory, stone, and place. Homo sapiens was one of those experiments before it became the only one left. Homo floresiensis was another, smaller in body, narrower in range, but still part of the same wide human question. To hold both truths at once is important. We are not less human because other humans once existed. We are more deeply human when we remember them. Our story becomes less proud, but more honest. It becomes less lonely in the past, even if it is lonely in the present. The tiny humans of Flores do not give us a complete answer to why human diversity ended. They do not tell us exactly when their last generation lived, what they felt, how they communicated, or whether they ever saw Homo sapiens with their own eyes. The truthful record stops before those answers arrive. But the absence of those answers does not weaken the lesson. It asks us to become better listeners. It asks us to hear the difference between what is known and what is imagined. It asks us to let mystery remain where evidence cannot speak. This kind of humility is not only useful for studying the past, it is useful for living in the present. We too live inside conditions we do not fully control. We too depend on food systems, water, climate, care, memory, and one another. We too are bodies before we are ideas. The ancient island of Flores makes that dependence visible in a small and distant form, but the rule has not disappeared. Life continues through relationships, between bodies and land, between children and care, between knowledge and memory, between a species and the world that allows it to remain. Homo floresiensis no longer walks that island as far as the evidence shows, but its trace still performs a quiet work. It makes the modern human pause. It softens the idea that we were always meant to stand alone. It reminds us that the Earth once held more than one human answer, and that most of those answers have gone silent. So when we imagine the cave at Liang Bua, the shoreline of Flores, the forest edge, the animals moving in darkness, and the small human body whose evidence reached so late into time, we are not only looking backward, we are learning how fragile every definition can be. If one tiny human species could live for so long in a small island world and then almost disappear from human memory, what else did the Earth once know about being human that we have not yet learned how to see?